Thank you, Mayor. So we're on item 14.2 and questions for Kimberly.
Yes. Are there any further questions for Ms. Zanino? All right. I have no more cards on this item. Mr. Schwedhelm.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I move a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Rosa approving the preliminary fiscal year 2018-19 sub-regional system operating capital and debt service budget and allocation of costs, and waive further reading the text.
Second.
Your votes. That passes with 7 ayes. Thank you. That was easy. 14.3, Ms. Combs. Ms. Hurtado.
Thank you, Mayor. 14.3, it's a report, subdivision improvements and bond proceeds disbursement agreement between the City of Santa Rosa and Sectarian Properties Incorporated. Gabe Osborne presenting.
Good evening, Mayor Corsi and members of the council. As mentioned in the introduction, the item before the council at this point in time is a subdivision improvements and bonds proceed disbursement agreement between the City of Santa Rosa and Sectarian Properties. I would like to begin the presentation by providing a brief background on the item, as well as discuss some of the steps that we took to get us where we are today. The proposed reimbursement agreement is associated with both public and private improvements that are required as part of the Village Gardens subdivision. The Village Gardens subdivision is currently under construction, is being marketed as Village Station, and is located on the corner of Sebastopol Avenue and Boyd Street. The project has a bit of a history. It's been around since 1999, so it received its original tentative map approvals by the Planning Commission on January 26, 1999. The final map was then recorded for the project on August 30th, 2005. Prior to recordation of the final map, the developer was required to submit a subdivision improvement agreement, which is commonly referred to as an SIA. And this is a fairly critical piece to the development of subdivisions, mainly because it's the developer's guarantee that they build the public and common area improvements. So once the map is recorded, it creates the legal lots, and the developer at that time has the ability to sell those off to separate individuals. So the subdivision improvement agreement is basically the guarantee that the utilities and the sidewalks and the roadways and the private parks and the community buildings are actually constructed. So along with the agreement, we also require that they execute financial securities. So as part of the agreement, they'll either submit bonds, which guarantee the full cost of the improvements, or cash securities. So both of these items were performed by the developer of Village Gardens, with the subdivision improvement agreement being executed on July 26, 2005, and along with that, we received bonds issued by Insurance Company of the West. I will be referring to them in the presentation as ICW. Unfortunately, this development did go through the downturn in the economy in the late 2000s, and it did fall victim to that event. So the developer was unable to complete the improvements and fulfill their obligations under the subdivision improvement agreement. The aerial to the right is not long after the site went dormant and is basically the condition in which the development was left. The next slide shows a zoomed in version of that photo. So what we can see is most of the grading was done. The roadways in this development, the interior streets are actually private. The utilities are public, so there's public sewer and water. So the roadways were paved, the utilities, some of them were tied in. Some of the main items that were not completed were the final improvements on Boyd Street and Sebastopol Avenue. So it was roughly at approximately 75% completion. Due to the downturn in the economy, this was not the only development that experienced these types of issues. So in the late 2000s, the Public Works Department at the time put some staffing resources towards addressing these issues. And what that really resulted in is staff in the Transportation and Public Works Department, in consultation with the City Attorney's Office, reaching out to the various bonding companies and trying to get them to the table. This exercise was successful in Village Gardens, and ICW was willing to talk about taking over the improvements, and that resulted resulted in the execution of what is referred to as a takeover agreement on October 11th, 2011. And under this agreement, ICW agreed to complete the remaining improvements in the development. And typically what we do with that process is we send our inspection team out, they develop a very detailed punch list of all the remaining improvements that need to be done, and that's attached as an exhibit to the agreement, and that reflects what needs to be completed. In April of 2015, that takeover agreement was amended to do two things. The lion's share of the improvements, they still carried forward. They wanted to defer the installation of the common area landscaping. In exchange for that, they were willing to perform additional reconstruction work on Boyd Street. And I will use the next slide to really describe what that means. So what we see in the development, the smaller squares are actually the specific lots, and the interior portion of that, which is highlighted by the red dots, is basically the common area, and that is made up of the streets and landscaping, and that has a significant square footage to it associated in this project. So the cost of the landscaping was fairly significant, and that wasn't really the issue in which ICW was wanting to move it out of the agreement for. It was mainly the maintenance of it, because at the time ICW was doing the improvements, the lots were either owned by the bank or a developer that was not really moving towards completing them, so there was no one in place to maintain it. Typically, once the lots sell, HOAs come into play, and then there's a mechanism for maintaining that landscaping. So ICW's concern was they expend a significant amount of resources in building it, and it dies within a year or two due to lack of maintenance. So in exchange for that, they were willing to perform additional paving work on Boyd Street. So the original conditions of the approval had the developer performing what are referred to as half-width improvements. So it essentially takes the center line of the road, and the development is required to replace the asphalt and build the improvements on their side of that center line. And that typically was when the development is done in sequence, to where, as we can see in Hickory Circle, they would have built their proportionate share of that. So in newer areas, that makes sense because the asphalt on the other side of the street is not that old. So they agreed to do it the full length of the project, which is basically that blue line. So now they're actually doing full width improvements. So the proposal is to go from curb to curb all the way down to essentially Earl Street. So as ICW began the construction, which took place in about March 2012, they excavated approximately 2,000 cubic yards of contaminated material. And this was found throughout the development site. It was also found in Boyd Street and Sebastopol Avenue. Unfortunately, not uncommon when the parcel has a history of commercial activity. And what they found was essentially motor oil. So the material was stockpiled on the site, and there is a formal disposal process they have to go, which actually has permit requirements associated with it. And that typically requires the property owner to participate in that as the generator of the material. And ICW at that time did not own the project. A few years after, we had Blue Mountain Homes actually purchase the parcels from the bankruptcy estate of the original developer, and then they conveyed the interest to Sectarian Properties. ICW and Blue Mountain were unable to come to an agreement on the permit process. So Blue Mountain was unwilling to act as the generator for the material. What that resulted in is ICW did not want to move forward with the completion of the improvements, and instead tendered an amount to the city of $1,186,340.98 to complete the improvements. So ever since receiving that amount, we've been trying to determine the most effective way to utilize the funds to complete the improvements. And there are a few different challenges. The city can process this as a capital project. It is of that scale. Unfortunately, that deals with prioritization of other capital projects, so timing becomes critical because the public improvements are actually needed for the delivery of the housing units. So on a separate track, we started discussions with Sectarian to see their willingness to complete the improvements, and they were. So they were willing to complete all the improvements as well as do the additional paving on Boyd Street that was part of the takeover agreement. That additional paving was not part of the original conditions of the development, so this was above and beyond what the developer was originally required to do. And they were also willing to do that in an amount less than the total amount that we accepted. So they are willing to accept $1,136,340.98, and $50,000 of that will be retained to cover the staffing costs associated with negotiating the original takeover agreement, as well as the agreement we see today. So this last slide is going to point out a few of the benefits of approving the agreement today. So we have reviewed the total amount and determined that it does represent a reasonable amount for the remaining cost of the improvements. So typically as part of that exercise, we require the developer to submit an engineer's estimate, which is a formal document that is stamped by a private engineer that line items all the remaining improvements and gives us a reasonable cost for those improvements. We compare that with other projects with similar improvements to ensure that it's in line to be built as a private development project. So it does, it gets pretty close. When we get down to some of the cleanup items that take place on developments, damaged sidewalk, time and materials type work, is a little difficult to pin those down, but for the bigger ticket items, such as the paving exercise, it is in line with those. The second benefit is Sectarian is willing to submit new performance and warranty bonds. So as part of this process, they are accepting responsibility as the developer, and they're giving those securities to us that we're currently missing. So they will basically cover all of the improvements associated from the subdivision from a performance standpoint, as well as give us warranty bonds for the 1 year after we do final acceptance for anything that happens to those improvements during that period. Thirdly, this item actually expedites the delivery of housing units because the developer now controls it. They can build that into their process. And additionally, it gives us better paving on Boyd Street, which is not part of the original conditions of approval. So that concludes the presentation. So I'd like to close by simply restating the recommendation, which is to recommend that the City Council approve the subdivision improvements and bonds proceeds disbursement agreement between the City of Santa Rosa and Sectarian Properties Incorporated. With that, I can open it up to any questions you may have.
Thanks, Gabe. That's an excellent presentation of a complex problem, and it seems like a pretty good solution. I did have one question, though. What happened to the dirt, the contaminated dirt?
It was disposed of through the proper channels. So basically, ICW, we agreed in concept to go forward with this proposal, and they wanted to keep the project moving. So although they know that it is a risk on their standpoint, they were willing to remove that material. So they did go through the appropriate permitting process, and it was disposed in the appropriate fashion.
Okay, thanks. Council, other questions? Yes, Ms. Combs. Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I appreciate that we have a bunch of different entities that have had issues with economics, and that may have led to failure to perform or couldn't come to an agreement. I wasn't able to sort out from the materials that I was looking at if there are natural persons associated with these entities that are also part of sectarian properties. Do we have knowledge of whether or not, for example, Blue Mountain or IWC, that any of the natural persons associated with that are also associated with sectarian properties?
I don't know that we've specifically analyzed that. I mean, the contract is proposed with Sectarian, who's the current owner of the lots. It's possible that Blue Mountain and Sectarian it's not unusual for developers to actually create separate entities to hold property that's in development.
Yes. I find it in future helpful to know some of the at least primary natural persons involved in something like this so that I can kind of keep track of sort of who's doing what. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you. I just wanted to make sure, because you didn't say it explicitly in the presentation, but none of the dollars for this is coming from the general fund. It's all dollars that have been paid into the city already for these improvements, and we're actually, it looks like, making $50,000 out of it. Okay, great. Just wanted to make sure.
Any other questions? Yes, Mr.
Thank you, Mayor. Excuse me. I'm curious. I understand that this was motor oil that was detected. How did it become evident that there was an issue with the soil?
So usually they can identify it with the excavation, and what that triggers is a very detailed analysis, because once you find it, you have to understand the scope of it. So it requires borings, it requires testing the stockpiles. So there is actually more of it out there that will need to be addressed as part of the reconstruction of the roadway, which is fairly typical, but they identify essentially kind of the plume, and if they find it, then they have a disposal process for it. So it's usually when they pull it out, they have some indicator that what they've disturbed disturbed has a potential contaminant in it, and that triggers our inspection staff to follow up and require the testing process.
It's just a testament to how careful we are as a city and the contractors in making sure that those kind of contaminants are not spread and that we mitigate them.
Yes.
Thank you.
Further questions? I have one card. I don't think that Peggy Hendricks is still here. And Ms. Combs, you have this item.
I do. Resolution of the City Council to approve the subdivision improvements and bond proceeds disbursement agreement between the City of Santa Rosa and Sectarian Properties Incorporated, and waive further reading of the text.
Second. On your votes? And that passes with 7 ayes. Thank you. Moving on to public hearings. Ms. Hurtado.
Item 15.1, public hearing, resilient city development measures. This item was continued from the April 24th regular meeting. Jessica Jones, supervising planner, presenting, joined by Deputy Director Claire Hartman and Director David Guin.
Okay, so we are having some technical difficulties. Unfortunately, the PowerPoint was not loaded, so we're going to see if we can go and find that. But in the meantime, I will give you a verbal presentation if that is okay.
Sure.
Thank you, Mayor Corsi and members of the council. The item before you is the resilient city development measures. You will recall that this item was before the council on April 3rd of this year. At that time, you considered an ordinance to add a new chapter to the zoning code, which is the resilient city development measures. That proposed chapter was proposed as a limited term 3-year ordinance, and it included a number of elements to it, including provisions for housing for temporary uses and temporary structures, as well as some accessory dwelling unit language that addressed housing citywide. There were also 3 additional provisions within that ordinance that proposed to reduce review authority for certain residential lodging and child care facility uses. There was concern by the council at that time that more consideration was needed on those 3 particular items. And so the council acted on the ordinance adopting the chapter addressing temporary housing, temporary structures, and accessory dwelling units, and continued the other 3 items regarding reduced review authority to the April 24th City Council meeting. And then at the April 24th Council meeting, the item was continued to tonight's meeting. Just to go back a little bit, the council heard a study session in December of 2017 regarding addressing housing in a citywide manner following the wildfires and the housing shortage the city has been dealing with. The idea was to look at expediting housing and other needs in a citywide manner. So following that study session, staff went back along with the comments that were provided by the council, as well as comments that the staff has received from various community members. Since the October fires, a draft Resilient City Development Measures Ordinance was prepared, which was what came before you on April 3rd, and then the rest of this is before you today. So there were a number of points of direction that the council provided at the April 3rd meeting. One of those was to provide specific criteria for those projects that would receive reduced review authority. And so in response to that, the draft ordinance that is before you today does include language to reduce review authority only if a project provides either on-site affordable housing or is within one of the city's priority development areas. There's also a provision within that for providing, requiring a neighborhood meeting for any of those types of projects. In addition to this language, some clarifying language was recently added to the ordinance that would exclude projects within preservation districts from being able to utilize this section of the code. The clarification was due to the need to really look more closely at developments and that transition between the city's urban core and the historic preservation districts. The next direction provided by council was to require that the zoning administrator meetings that are held for our minor use permit and minor design review projects for the affected projects for this ordinance be held in the evening. And so language was included in the draft ordinance that would require that any zoning administrator meeting for projects pursuant to this chapter would be held at or after 5 p.m. at City Hall. The council also provided direction to include emergency shelters in the list for uses that would be have the reduced review authority. So they would reduce the permitting requirements for emergency shelters in the zones in which they're currently allowed from a major conditional use permit to a minor conditional use permit. And the council wanted to exclude the 2 open space districts where emergency shelters are currently allowed with a major use permit. This provision was in the original draft of the ordinance when it went to the Planning Commission. Prior to coming to City Council in April, the commission raised a number of concerns regarding emergency shelters and felt that they were a type of use that should continue to come forward to the Planning Commission. So they recommended that those be eliminated from the ordinance, which is why it was not before you on April 3rd. But at the council's direction, we did add that use back in, but did exclude the open space zoning district. And then finally, the council gave direction to require monthly reports on implementation of the ordinance. We looked at whether this should be in the zoning code, but ultimately determined that that was not a good place for it. The purpose of the code is to provide standards and regulations and requirements for development. And so report outs on implementation of the code generally are not identified in the code, but staff is committed to bringing those reports to the council at regular intervals. Before I get to the recommendation, I did want to mention that staff has received some comments from the public regarding the environmental review process, and there is an outline in the staff report and in the ordinance that identifies the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, exemptions for adoption of this ordinance. It identifies a number of exemptions, but again, those exemptions are related to the adoption of this ordinance. It does not affect projects coming in utilizing this ordinance. Most of the projects that would utilize this section of the ordinance would continue to require some sort of discretionary review, namely minor use permit, or excuse me, minor design review, which would trigger a requirement to review the California Environmental Quality Act as it pertains to that particular project. There's only a couple instances when a project would be exempt from CEQA, and that would primarily be for development of a single-family residential home, and if a new large family daycare was to come into an existing single-family home where they're not proposing to make any exterior changes, and then potentially the mobile home parks. But really any other projects that are identified within this ordinance would require their own California Environmental Quality Act review. So I just want to make that one clarification. And so with that, the Planning Commission and the Planning and Economic Development Department are recommending that the council introduce this ordinance, and we are here to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you. Council, questions on this? Do we have any cards on this? You have some questions? Yes, thank you. Go ahead, Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So you had mentioned one of the council directions was to, well, first of all, I'll start with the council direction to include the emergency shelters. To the best of my knowledge, that actually was not council direction. That was a council member's direction, and we didn't actually get into the discussion because we moved half of the items. So I'd like us to actually have that discussion. When you say you've provided specific criteria for those projects that would receive reduced review authority, the two criteria that you have laid out were the affordability and then into the PDAs. Specifically, what I'm looking for is, it was mentioned in the last discussion that not all projects would actually be subject to this, that if staff found that a project was particularly controversial or had a lot of neighborhood engagement on the issue, that it would go through its normal process. What I'm looking for is what criteria are staff going to actually use to determine which projects they deem to be not controversial and which projects they deem to have sufficient public input. And in particular, and I've talked to Mr. Gillen about this, I've heard from neighbors over in the West End that they had a petition of 51 neighbors opposing a change to the hours of a store, and that was deemed to not be sufficient to go through this normal process. Can you walk us through that a little bit? I would assume 51 neighbors would constitute neighborhood interest.
I'll walk through the criteria that staff has used for elevating minor permits to the Planning Commission or Design Review Board. It's not a specific threshold like how many neighbors have filed a petition or registered complaints against a land use. As you can imagine, we get letters of support, we get letters of opposition, and we process hundreds of applications every year. We have did some research since our last meeting, and we have elevated really just a handful of minor permits to the commission level. These include the Say Dream Center, Bodine, Redwood Gospel Mission, And recently, a project that was quite complex in terms of its legal nonconforming status and whether that was expanding or not, adjacent to a smart station. So really the criteria isn't the number of opposed citizens, it's the complexity of the perspectives that are brought forward in the decision-making process, and it's the weight of the balance of how complex that spectrum is in terms of balancing competing policies. So for example, the emergency shelters, Redwood Gospel Mission and the Say Dream Center, it wasn't about how many people were saying the same theme of opposition or the same theme of support. It was the complexity across those spectrums that brought it to our attention that a single decision maker is not appropriate to balance such the spectrum of perspectives, that really a 7-member body like the Planning Commission warranted that land use decision. And so we do hundreds of minor use permits per year. It's 80% of our use permit work is minor permits. And only a handful in the last 10 years have been elevated to the Planning Commission. So one test if that's working is, are there appeals? Is there questioning of those decisions for those minor permits or not? And we don't get very many appeals, but when we do, obviously that's another mechanism. So I would say it's the substantiveness and the complexity of the issues that are brought forward. In the case of the West End project, the scope of the project was adding an hour in the morning and adding an hour in the evening. The land use was what was of interest to the neighbors, and that the actual land use of a convenience market serving alcohol was not actually before the decision maker was adding an hour in the morning and in the evening. And it wasn't as complex, obviously, in scale with these other decisions. So one of the things about elevation is that the community does need to rely on the zoning code for predictability in terms of process, due process, decision-making authority. That organization is really critical so that there's predictability across all of our stakeholders, whether you're an applicant, a resident, staff, and how to process this. So it's very clear to our public, and so that's why we do rely on the specific code structure.
Right, and I think actually that's a good segue. One of my biggest concerns has been if you have parts of this that are subjective, how can the public trust that there aren't backroom deals, that it's not a good old boys network that's getting projects done where some are getting elevated and some aren't? That's why I'm looking for some clear direction on how things are going to be assessed, whether they get elevated or not.
Well, these handful 5 projects over the last 10 years were not backroom deals. They were of such great public controversy over a course of time.
I'm not saying that they were. I'm not concerned about the ones that were elevated. I'm actually more concerned about the ones that were not elevated. How do you determine when something does not get elevated and goes through this streamlining, particularly given that the public's ability to see the process is severely diminished at that moment? And having worked in government for a long time, I know people don't trust the process normally, but especially when they don't get to actually be a part of it and see it.
The trust in the process is that it's directed and clarified in the zoning code, and we follow that code. I think it would be quite unpredictable if we did not follow the code. So we're very particular making sure that we follow that code because that is the transparency of document of how we process entitlements.
I think I'll just add on to that. I think the example you brought up is a good one in terms of the hour of operation. That's one where we did receive those signatures. We did go through that process of evaluating should we elevate that or not. The decision was made not to. We documented the reasons for that. I don't know if I have that memo here, but at that meeting, we were very explicit about the people in the room's rights to appeal this decision. We were making a decision based on the set of facts brought before us. It was a public meeting. We laid out the appeal process and what that would be, the timelines, and so that they could appeal that if that's something that they wanted to do, and they decided not to.
Great. So we've talked a little bit about the neighborhood meeting. For the section of the ordinance that reduces things to by right, what would the appeal process be, and how would people have any opportunity to go about that.
So the neighborhood meeting requirement is for is for the design review process and brings it down to minor design review. So it is still a public process. It goes through the zoning administrator, and there is an appeal period from the date that the zoning administrator takes action, and it's 10 days, and we send out a notice of action from the zoning administrator meeting to let properties in the surrounding area know that an action was taken, what that action was, and what the appeal process is.
So this might be a little bit more helpful for me if, so some of the emails that we've gotten have said that if this ordinance passes, for example, Emerald Isle would have never gone through its process, Sinead wouldn't have to go through its process. Can you respond to some of that a little bit?
So for example, Sinead project is coming forward to Santa Rosa, and it's a quite complex environmental project, land use project, will involve quite a number of entitlements and decisions for the city. It's of a scale that we have not seen in my time here all at once, and so while we will wait to receive the applications and look at what is before us, one of the decisions is to evaluate, is this of that scale? And it's quite likely to be found of that scale of complexity, just the broad scope of the different perspectives that are in the balancing of interests that will be needed for that process. So while yes, the streamlining that we have because and if it has affordable housing, and that was what's before you as a response to the last meeting's direction, is to look for criteria upon which you would get the streamlining. We added the, if you have inclusionary affordable housing. If Sinead had that, then that would be sort of the first benchmark, but it's likely to be elevated just because it's clearly of a scale and a level of complexity that warrants a balancing of interest at a board level. Emerald Isle, I don't know, trying to do retroactive review of if that would be elevated or not, I can't say.
So this is kind of on this particular point where I'm having a little bit of trouble, because I'm hearing predictability, what's in the ordinance, what people can rely on, but then I'm also hearing a really subjective nature to this, and in fact, the section that's by right in here has community care facilities of 7 or more clients. So when we talk about a project like Sinead that has gotten a lot of attention from the public, a lot of press around it, a lot of community input around it, I'm seeing multiple reasons in this ordinance that if you were going by the text of the ordinance, it would be streamlined and it'd be by right, as opposed to what I'm hearing is because of the scale and the scope of the ordinance, you'd elevate it. So I'm trying to quantify how this plays out. And I apologize to you, Sinead, as an example. It's just a high profile thing that we're dealing with that people can wrap their head around.
Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a good question, but Sinead is going to be one of the biggest projects we have processed in some time, so I think it's probably not the flagship for the streamlining ordinance because it's so unusual in terms of the scope and the scale and the level of intensity. It's similar to the SAY Dream Center. Before we even held our first neighborhood meeting, we felt the interest in setting up a project webpage. We had hundreds and hundreds of comment letters pro and against, and frankly, Sinead is of that same caliber already, and it hasn't come in for its entitlements. So I think it's a bit unusual, that project. I think the focus of this ordinance, the way we have drafted it, and again, this is an exercise of trying to be responsive to input that we've received to date, is to focus on streamlining housing in our downtown and have inclusionary housing. Sinead just happens to be a very extreme case of that in terms of scale.
Right, and I apologize, I don't mean to go to the most extreme example of it, it's just the one that's top of the mind. Is there a way that we can codify in the ordinance what the process would be for elevation? And I asked this last time, some form of a check from the council to be able to look at a list and say, all right, I'm not hearing about these 10 projects, but this last one, I'm hearing quite a bit about it, and there should be some opportunity for the public to weigh in.
Yeah, I think the way this ordinance is written is written in a way that is trying to provide a pathway to streamline this. If we start to add different layers of checks in with the council, it adds again another layer of complexity with 7 members, that uncertainty. And I think what we want to do is use the process we have now, again, evaluating each project, making sure that it makes sense to be eligible for the streamlined process, and move it through with the intention in mind, as well as we understand the position that you're raising. We're well aware of that. Again, this is a pilot study to try to see, does this work? We're going to be evaluating this very closely, and anybody eligible through this process in this short time frame is going to be scrutinized to make sure that it's an appropriate project for this.
Yeah, and I completely understand that. I understand it's a 3-year ordinance and that there's going to be a lot of scrutiny on it. I'm also looking at the fact that anything that does get approved is going to be permanent from that point forward.
I understand.
So
yep.
I know we've got to get it right. I'd be a little bit more comfortable with this if the concessions were limited, particularly the by right area, was limited to the PDA, or was specifically the PDA in the downtown core. I might be more comfortable with this. And I think that should be on the table for discussion as well.
And so just to clarify, that's the use permit section discussion, to limit that to the PDA, similar to what we talked about for the design review process.
Well, as I read the ordinance, I might just be reading it incorrectly. It appears that the PDA section or the affordable, and we can talk about what the definition of affordable is as well, because I think that that's important to codify, only applies to the modifications for design review process, not to the by right
That's
section.
correct, absolutely. That's correct.
Okay. So getting to that last question, this says affordable. Are we just using, what metrics are we using for affordability?
So we're tying it to chapter 21-02, which is our housing allocation plan, and we worked with the housing division on this language, and so it would need to meet the criteria in the housing allocation plan, but it would have to be on site. They would not be able to provide in lieu fees to get out of it.
And it would be restricted by a regulatory agreement, units that would be restricted by agreement as well.
Is there any minimum requirement?
So the requirement is for 15% affordability.
Are you done, Mr. Rogers?
Probably not.
Come back to you.
Yeah, I'll hold on for now.
Ms. Combs.
Thank you. I think I've mentioned previously that 15% number keeps appearing, and we don't ever have an opportunity to have a full discussion over what's an appropriate number. So while I am delighted and appreciate the inclusion of affordability as one of the criteria, it continues to concern me that we haven't had a conversation about, for example, that we might take less if the level of affordability is 30% AMI or less, but we might want more if the level of affordability is 80% or higher. And we haven't had an opportunity to have that conversation, so the 15% number keeps being repeated without a conversation here. I apologize, that's really a concern of mine. More of a comment than a question. That I have a question about, well, I too have a question concerning the Sinead project. I have a set of drawings of what might be being proposed. It's a large project with lots of features. I appreciate that you might have spontaneously moved it forward, raised it up, but I think that the predictability is a two-way street, that the neighbors around an area, in general, people who have to live with something should have a predictable say in what it is they're going to have to live with. I think that's a principle. If you're going to have something suddenly appear next to you, when you bought your land, you did your due diligence, you looked at your zoning, you looked at, and it seems to me that we're changing the rules suddenly on whether or not they're going to even know if there's something happening. We experience regularly, and I'm sure you do too, that we've gone through whatever process we've gone through, and neighbors say, I'm opposed to that late, right? They come in and say, I didn't hear about it. We just had that experience with the small cell towers. It was a year later when neighbors saw them being built that we understood it was a controversial item. So I understand that the systems that we use are fallible now. It feels to me as if this creates a even more likely to be fallible system, that individuals are not going to know that something is being heard, and then they're not going to know to appeal in an appropriate time frame. Because they're not going to figure it out until it's going in, because they didn't receive the traditional public notices that they would have normally received. At least it looks like that. For example, we recently changed our hotel rules, and I remember expressing concern particularly that we were broadening the hotel rules as much as we were. We broadened it to the point where, at least in a neighborhood that I'm very familiar with, Bethards and Yalupa, this is a small commercial area adjacent to a residential neighborhood. That area got targeted for allowing hotels. It seems to me that under this, the neighbors now wouldn't have to know a hotel was going in there unless you made that decision. And that's not predictable for neighbors. I understand we're trying to be predictable for people developing, but we have an obligation to be predictable for neighbors as well. So I'm really concerned, particularly with the recent changes in the hotel rules, that hotels are going to just appear places and people are going to be surprised by them. If you're going to bring all hotels up to us because we know they're controversial, then why have they been included here? That doesn't make sense to me. I have a question about the emergency shelters issue. It seems to me that one of the intents of doing an emergency ordinance, that the ordinance that we've been doing, the emergency homeless ordinance, was to ensure that we had a mechanism to go in some ways during an emergency to expedite construction of a shelter or a temporary shelter, and that was part of the feature of having the emergency ordinance. It allowed us to have flexibility with our zoning and our land use. So if we've already done that, why are we encoding it here? It didn't make sense to me. Obviously, I'm a person who supports having there be emergency shelters. But my understanding is we took care of this by having an emergency ordinance for homelessness. How do neighbors know to bring up a controversy if it's gone through the zoning administrator? Just how does a neighbor know that it's you're making an assumption that you know what's controversial for my neighbors. And I'm not sure that I always understand what's controversial for my neighbors, and they talk to me regularly. So how does a neighbor know? I'm just asking you, in this document, how does a neighbor know that something's been declared not controversial and is moving forward?
So one thing I did want to clarify is that for the minor use permits and minor design review that goes before the zoning administrator, there is a notice that goes out 10 days prior to the meeting to properties within 400 feet. And there is information on there about the meeting, about its location, the proposal that is before the zoning administrator, as well as information on how to request a public hearing if one wishes to do so. So that information is available so that neighbors know about the project going forward. The other...
If I could, that doesn't apply to the by right section, correct?
That is correct. So the uses that are identified for by right would be done through a zoning clearance, which is not a notice process. The other thing I wanted to clarify is lodging facilities are not listed in the uses for reduced review authority.
And then just to follow up, I was taking...
Just a second, because I thought I'd read pretty carefully. Hold on a second. 16.080, changes to approval residential lodging or childcare facility projects.
So that is to an approved project, so a project that has already gone through the entitlement process. If they want to make a change to a project, right now, even if it's a very minor change, it would have to go to the zoning administrator. If it is a change that involves something that would address the conditions of approval or a mitigation measure, it automatically has to go back to the review authority. But any other change, no matter how minor it is, would have to go to the zoning administrator. And what this is doing is providing criteria to allow those very minor changes to be done at the director level. So again, that's
the director as opposed to the zoning administrator, which is already kind of skipping a step.
Right, but again, this would be to a project that is already approved and has already gone through that entitlement and public process.
But they're making changes. So what's the extent of the changes? If Sinead wanted to become, this is an example, hypothetically, if a project similar to Sinead made a decision instead of having a smaller area be residential, if they decided to have it be a larger area that's lodging, would that constitute having another review, or would that?
Yes, so if I may, I'll just read.
Help me understand how, I mean, I have a proposed hypothetical project.
Right, so
I'm just trying to figure out how that would apply.
So there is 4 criteria that has to be met as drafted here to be going to the director. That is that the change is consistent with all applicable provisions of the zoning code. It does not involve a feature of the project that was a basis for a finding of a negative declaration or environmental impact report. It does not involve a feature of the project that was specifically addressed or was a basis for conditions of approval for the project, and does not result in an expansion of a single family or multifamily residential small lot subdivision, lodging, or childcare land use or activity. And so that they would have to meet all of those criteria in order for the change to be approved at the director level. Otherwise, it would have to go back to the review authority that originally approved the project. And the other thing I wanted to note in this section is that we do have a provision in here for notification of any action taken by the director to neighbors 10 days prior to taking that action.
And then how much time do they have to respond after the action is taken?
There's a 10-day appeal period from the date of action.
And how much does the appeal cost?
We think we'll look it up right now. It's around $500.
So it'll be harder to do an appeal in a poorer neighborhood. You know, if I'm in Fountain Grove, I can appeal because I probably have the resources, or choose a McDonald neighborhood. But if I'm in the Roseland area, maybe I don't have $500 for an appeal. So that concerns me that it will also, one of the side effects of this will be to direct certain kinds of projects in certain areas. That's a concern of mine. I have had a particular builder explain to me that the reason he wanted to avoid design review was because something in the design review process led it to be kicked into a further CEQA analysis. So I'm trying to figure out, is there a process whereby if there's an appeal in design review or a question that's raised within design review, is there a CEQA process that gets triggered by being in design review? I'm trying to figure out what this gentleman was saying. His reason for wanting to have this kind of expedited thing was because he felt that DRB led him into CEQA.
Any discretionary approval would trigger CEQA review, the appropriate level of CEQA review. So if there was no discretionary approval, no design review, the project needed a building permit and it was permitted by right, that's a ministerial action under CEQA and would not then trigger CEQA review or analysis. If there's any discretionary approval, even at this director level potentially, there would be a CEQA analysis similar, and it should not differ whether it's minor or not minor.
So he may be confused. If it's the zoning administrator who makes the decision, is that considered administrative, or does that trigger CEQA?
Still a discretionary approval that would trigger an analysis under CEQA to determine the appropriate level of CEQA analysis.
So I think he may be a bit confused. My understanding is this is a pilot project. Is that correct? The plan is that we're going to do this for 3 years and see how it works, except of course a building that's built during this 3-year period lasts longer than 3 years.
Yes, the way it's written is 3 years, and then to report on it as we progress to make sure that the council understands how it's being used.
Okay. Just so you know, we've had fairly extensive conversations about our station areas, the downtown station area plan, the north station area plan, and our downtown core. We've had the kind of full community conversation about what's to be expected in those areas. So from my point of view, those are the areas where it's appropriate to do this kind of pilot, because those are the areas where residents already have had a lot of input into what's going to happen in their neighborhoods. And for me, it should apply to 16.060, 0.070, and 0.080, all three should have this provision for downtown core, North Station area, and downtown station area. That's where I'm leaning now. I will listen to public comment on it, but it would concern me because we don't have the kinds of conversations with neighbors about their community and what can go and not go in their zoning areas to know what's controversial even yet. So that would be the approach that I would prefer to use. Thank you.
Thank you, and I'll just confirm the appeal cost, since we said we would look it up. It's $475.
Mr. Tibbetts.
$475, thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. So one quick question that I have is, does the provision of 10,000 square feet in total floor area apply to the uses in section 060?
So the provision for 10,000 square feet is related to the design review and what triggers the next level in design review. So the way our code currently reads, if your project is 10,000 square feet or greater, or in a visually sensitive area, it would require review by the design review board. And so the way it reads in this proposed ordinance is that those types of projects would be the ones that would need to go for concept design review by the design review board.
I'm just thinking aloud at this point to potentially mitigate, and please tell me the consequences of what this addition would do, but to mitigate the impacts of this ordinance as written, to kind of satisfy what Vice Mayor Rogers brought up about a large scale project, for example, and to your point, Ms. Hartman, about the law is the law, right? The zoning code has to be clear, not arbitrary. would it make sense to apply a square footage cap to 060? Would that be possible, and what would the unintended consequences be? Because a lot of those uses in there, I think 20,000 square feet, for example, could satisfy a lot of what that's trying to do, what that can achieve, but also really kind of head off at the pass the potential for a large project. And again, I don't think you're gonna sneak one by us, right? And I don't think anybody up here on the council does either. But what we have to do is be very clear in our zoning code. And so what would that do?
Yeah, and I think that's a reasonable approach. And if that's a criteria that we want to set that says anything at 10,000, 20,000 square feet wouldn't be eligible for this process, we could definitely address that.
Thank you. Another question that I had was about actually on the issue of the homeless shelters. I, for one, will be supporting that. I think it's critically important, especially everything that we just went through tonight and the past few nights. I can also speak to it personally, my experience with by right access to a homeless shelter and how beneficial that was. But in the ordinance, I think it's on page 5, sorry, my iPad's down, here we go. In section 4, it says emergency shelter is hereby permitted with the approval of a minor use permit within the rural residential, single family residential, medium density, multifamily residential. So a lot of the residential uses, and it does not contain kind of a person cap. Yet in 5 and 6, there is 50 or fewer beds, 51 or more beds. And what I'm trying to get at is I think if we're starting to introduce homeless shelters into neighborhoods, at the very least, there probably does need to be some sort of criteria. Am I reading this correctly, that there's basically no established criteria for a shelter bed?
Yeah, so I'll just clarify the reason why there's those 3 different categories. So we have a distinction with the 50 or fewer or 51 or greater, and that is because in the commercial section of our code, we allow emergency shelters of 50 or fewer beds. I'm pretty sure it's by right in the general commercial zone, and that is required by state law. And so we had to differentiate 50 or fewer, 51 or greater in the commercial section. In the residential section of the code, it does not have that distinction, so we just looked at just emergency shelters across the board right now require major conditional use permit.
So I guess if I'm a nonprofit and I purchase a home in a neighborhood, it's a 4-bedroom house, I would be able to have by right access to putting an unlimited number of people in that house?
So with emergency shelters, it would require a minor use permit. The only zone that allows emergency shelters by right is in the general commercial zone, and if it's 50 or fewer beds.
Okay, I apologize, but I guess I'm still not following then why that's in there for residential.
So it would be reducing the review authority from major use permit to minor use permit in those residential zones. So,
I get that, but yeah. Are we placing homeless people in residential houses?
So
is that the objective of this?
We have yet to have one come through in a residential zone, so I think we would have to look and see what the project is, but
we're making that possible.
Yeah, so they are currently allowed in those residential zones. They just have to go through the major use permit process rather than minor use permit.
So again, I guess what I'm saying is I support it being in a residential neighborhood under a minor use permit, but I think when it comes to the sensitivity of a residential neighborhood, you can't pack 4 people to a 4-bedroom room and potentially have 16 cars in the neighborhood. So I think I'm the one carrying the ordinance, so I may propose some sort of a cap there as well, consistent with sections 5 and 6, if that makes sense to you. And that wouldn't, again, I don't know what conversations you're having out in the community, but if there would be any unintended consequences with doing that.
Yeah, and the other thing I would clarify is that we do have specific criteria in our code for emergency shelters, including parking requirements and whatnot. And so through that minor use permit process, we would be looking at making sure that it complies with all of those regulations.
What is the parking requirement?
I can look it up.
Okay, it's all right. I don't want to take any more of your time. I'm trying to think if I had anything else. Oh, the other thing too, and this will just be a general question, my last one. But in this process, as we look at being a more expeditious planning department, have we looked at pursuing a direct review ordinance at the city where you take a lot of these projects that you feel are very high profile, have huge community benefit, especially given our existing circumstances post-fire, and just bring them directly to the council? I'm aware that a lot of these ordinances exist in other cities and counties, and it basically allows you to bypass all the other commissions, puts all the political pressure on us, and we up or down it. Was that considered ever?
So I'll take a first shot at it, and then Claire can jump in. The way that we try to typically work that is, again, if it's a controversial project, a project that you're talking about, we would elevate it to a board or commission, such as Design Review Board or Planning Commission. That way, the council has the benefit of that information when they hear the item, if it does get appealed, which typically those controversial projects do. And then you have additional information from your appointee on either board to help make that decision, is typically the pathway that we encourage.
Right, I definitely appreciate their input, and I like that we have those bodies to do that vetting, because frankly, they probably do a more detailed vetting than we do. But I think that is something to look at, given, we're talking about these emergency measures that are temporary to address our situation. I think a direct review ordinance, and I won't pursue any action on it tonight, but just might be worth looking into and pursuing. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you. Mr. Schwedhelm.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just have one question about the appeal, because it is concerning, depending upon where you are in Santa Rosa, the $475 may be prohibitive to appeal it. What would you anticipate being the consequences or unintended consequences of waiving the appeal fee?
The fee is part of a cost recovery process, so again, staff time, so part of that would just be, we would reflect it in our budget as we come forward.
But we have the legal authority to say we're going to waive fees during this 3-year period.
As part of this, you can't increase the fees because we haven't done notice, but you could always decrease the fees or eliminate the fees, such as we did for the ADU policy and other things.
Great, thank you.
Mr. Sawyer.
Thank you, Mayor. I've had a couple of people come to me and ask about the issue of aesthetics. And it's one of the things that the design review, they struggle with that at times, and getting 7 people to agree on a particular aesthetic. How do I respond to the concern that some people have that when reducing the level of review, that our guidelines will be, how are those followed when you're dealing with one person making a decision on a particular building as opposed to 7? One could, I would argue that it would be a higher level of expectation, that there would be a little more predictability. At the same time, you're having one person review a project and its aesthetics as opposed to several that can bounce ideas back and forth. How do you respond to these several community members that brought that concern to me?
It's a valid point and a valid concern, but we do have our design guidelines that are very clear that help us in processing these, and projects that go through the process are reviewed against those guidelines and in staff's recommendation. And we also have specific findings that have to be made for each project, and the staff planner will bring this forward to the zoning administrator, the same as we do to the design review board, and provide all the findings that staff has made in the review process and how those guidelines have been met. And the other thing to keep in mind is that these bigger projects will continue to be required to be reviewed by the design review board at the conceptual level. So the board will have input into these projects, and that their input will be provided to the zoning administrator for consideration in that process.
And I would assume that when on the report back that we'll be getting on a monthly basis, that we'll be able to get a sense of the success or the challenges that you'd be facing, assuming that these changes go forward tonight. It would be good to hear both positives and negatives, because it because we are so used to a certain process that we've been used to for so many years, those changes can be unnerving at times. And I'm looking forward to trying to streamline it with predictability and not compromise the aesthetic of the downtown or any other part of Santa Rosa. But it will be important to get those report backs because we are changing a process that people have become, some people are comfortable with, some people are frustrated by, but it is what it is. And I'm looking forward to trying something new and different. And my concern is the end product, and that's where the trust comes in, and knowing that our staff will be following the same guidelines that our design review follows. I mean, that's basically what happens. It would be just a smaller number of people, but they're still using the same guidelines. There would not be a reduced list of guidelines that would be that the people with the projects or the proposals would have to jump through. So the hoops don't change in number. It's just the person or the people reviewing would decline in numbers. Thank you.
And just as a follow-up, the zoning administrator is just like any other review authority. You can take an action on what's presented. You can ask questions. You can ask for further information, further response. If there's a particular design guideline where there's a question of how it's applied, zoning administrator has all those same levels of authority. And it's not uncommon if there's a missing landscaping plan or is not a clear application of design guidelines, that to continue the item and ask the applicant to come back with more details on how they're responsive to those design guidelines. So.
And could you explain to me the preliminary review, how that process functions? For
at the zoning administrator level?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Well, when the design review board would be involved, how does that, if you could just give me a sense of a sketch of what that would look like as opposed to what we currently review.
So the streamlined proposal that you're considering tonight would, for major applications, and again within the caveats of planned development districts or with inclusionary housing and outside a historic district, they would go to the design review board like they normally would, but instead of going for preliminary design review, they would go early with a conceptual design review application. And the board would provide feedback like they do, and they would go through the guidelines with what's presented. And if it was clear that there was good feedback from the design review board, the applicant could then continue on in the process. And then the next step for entitlement would be with the zoning administrator. If it wasn't clear, we would probably suggest that the applicant go back to the design review board to get clear feedback, because certainly that's going to be a resource for our zoning administrator, is that feedback. Prior to that concept design review, there would be a pre-application neighborhood meeting. So for these projects, there's early intervention by the design review board on design and early input by the neighbors for a pre-application neighborhood meeting. So we added that in too, to address that concern. But in the end, instead of going back to the design review board for final action, it would rest with the zoning administrator for those projects.
Great.
And then that would be subject to appeal process.
Thank you.
Further questions? Mr. Tibbetts?
I'll hold my question, actually.
Ms. Combs.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up a little bit. I recall when this came to us before, asking that you bring back with you this time data on how many had gone, how many plans does the design review board just say, go ahead and let the staff handle the corrections that they've called for and that the plan doesn't come back to them anyway. My understanding is that that's typical habit of the design review board, that they regularly say they don't want to see it back again. And I had specifically asked for that data to come back to us so we could see if that was needed.
Yeah, I apologize. Unfortunately, we don't have that information. But just to clarify, what we're talking about, there's 3 meetings for the design review board.
Yes.
There's the the actual meeting, and then the final.
Right.
And so what you're referring to is from the final one being removed. What we're saying is that the middle one would be removed through this process, but we'd keep that first one.
Yeah.
But we can. I apologize
still
for not
like
getting
the
that
data.
information. So we can get that, and it's something, again, depends on how that goes. But we'll get that information for you.
So I have a question about the conceptual level, and let's use the Morgan Street, A Street project as a hypothetical. I understand that one is currently in a historic area. This wouldn't apply to them because of the historic designation. But if the line for the historic district were somewhere else, I'd like to use that project as an example here. What I have seen and talked with my Cultural Heritage Board and DRB member, there wasn't a lot of information in the conceptual drawings. It was in fact very difficult for them to make some of the kinds of comments they might have wanted to make, but they felt the need to not make them immediately, but wait for the next set of drawings to come through. Can you be clear for us at that first conceptual level, what's required and what doesn't come with a set of plans? Because I've been on DRB, and my recollection is the conceptual level is really vague. I mean, basically, it's very hard to tell what the project is going to look like, what it's going to be.
Yeah, and at that level, it is oftentimes, very preliminary. They're trying to get an idea from the board. We do oftentimes see, preliminary design review come through with much more detail. So I think in that instance, if we were to have an applicant come in with a project at a conceptual level that had that limited amount of detail, that would be an instance where it would be recommended that it go back for an additional conceptual design review.
Or as an alternative, we require the conceptual level drawing to have a higher level of detail.
One of the process improvements that we're looking at outside of this, just in general for all applications, is to look at our concept design review, and as part of one of our housing action plan initiatives is to look at improvements to the design review process, and one of them is to look at some minimum requirements for concept design review in terms of a checklist.
I am having difficulty with this in part because the concept review just doesn't have enough information now as it goes forward. So DRB really isn't getting to look at enough information at the concept review stage. The second question that I have has to do with our staff's landscaping knowledge. I don't have any information that would indicate we have any landscaping knowledge among our planning staff, plan review staff. And yet I'm very aware that previous design review boards have caught some significant problems with landscaping, like putting 2 plants next to each other that require different levels of water. So one of the 2 of them was not going to make it. And that the design review board has landscape personnel on it that helps notify of those kinds of problems. Are we planning on increasing or changing our staff so that we have landscaping information so that the plants don't die?
You're correct. We don't have landscape architects or landscape designers, credentialed designers as our planners. They're general planners. We receive general training on this, and we apply the design guidelines. And ultimately, including the design review board, we have a water efficient landscape policy. So in the end, it's the water efficient landscape policy team that implements these landscaping rules at plan check. So at design review, it's a higher level. It's not at plan check, right? So at design review, you're looking at application of design guidelines, themes, thematic applications of, our relationships with plants and things like that. So it's at that level that for minor projects, staff does have abilities to do that. And for these projects, they'll still get that review by the design review board at concept level, and we'll make use of that. But in the end, at plan check prior to implementation, we do have a water efficient team that is specialized in landscaping, and the city does rely on that team.
So would you expect that a concept plan would have that kind of landscaping detail?
Concept landscaping plan is one of the items that we look for concept review, but we will have to look at what are the minimum requirements to submit for concept. And one of the things is trying something new. We don't have exact, we're going to make the most of this, and if it turns out that we need to be a little bit more specific on our concept design review checklist to make this work, to make it clear so that the applicants come in with all the sheets that they need to come in to get the right kind of clear feedback, we're going to do that. We're going to try to make this successful and as transparent as we can, but the idea is to try something different.
So the DRB guidelines are called guidelines. What does that mean that it's called a guideline? What kind of weight does it mean that it's called a guideline?
So we generally refer to them as guidelines or preferences. So they set a direction, a sort of a directive policy. It's not a development standard that thou shalt, have every 5 feet this type of plant. It's directive themes that you should have sufficient landscaping to provide, general coverage of your entry area or parking area. So it's directive preferences, not explicit, thou shalt have exactly this.
So what we're doing is shifting staff from reading essentially exacting regulations, like a plan review might typically do, to interpreting whether something meets a set of guidelines?
So we regularly do this. 80% of our planning entitlements are at the minor permit level or director level. 80%. So we regularly are processing minor design review and applying our design guidelines and applying zoning code development standards. That's what we're trained to do, and that's what we do on a regular basis. What's before you tonight is seeing if there is interest on the level of the council to raise that bar so that the zoning administrator would have the opportunity for these select projects in these select areas under these unusual circumstances in an interest to streamline housing and these other related uses, to raise that bar that the zoning administrator would have then additional responsibilities in this interim time period. That's the exercise that's before you tonight, and we've just tried to produce some options for you.
Mr. Tibbetts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So one of the questions I had was, well, actually 2 questions. 060 in the ordinance, does that apply citywide? I need to better understand what's applying. So did we just restrict 070 to the PDA? Because I'm actually looking at that thinking, I'm not sure that makes sense. To me, the intent for by right with an inclusionary component should be in our station area, priority development areas.
Yeah, so as drafted, the limiting it to the PDA areas or with an affordable component is in the design review section, but certainly could be added to the other sections.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to the public now. Got several cards. We'll start with Richard Drury, followed by Terry Shore.
Thank you, honorable members of the council. My name is Richard Drury with the law firm of Lozo Drury. I'm representing the Laborers International Union of North America, Local 324, and the Roseland Action Community Organization. Together, these organizations represent several hundred Santa Rosa residents who are very concerned about this ordinance. We urge you to reject the ordinance and require CEQA review under the California Environmental Quality Act. As I think this discussion has brought out, this ordinance is stunningly overbroad and lacks any clear standards. What we're told by the staff is that if a project is of a certain scale and complexity, they'll elevate it, and then it will require CEQA review. Staff cannot be making decisions without fixed standards that are clear to the public. That's a real problem because projects, this ordinance makes many projects that currently require discretionary review to become by right. When a project is by right, CEQA review is not required. The ordinance relies on 3 CEQA exemptions, primarily the emergency exemption. The emergency exemption is limited to reconstruction and rebuilding homes or properties that were damaged in an emergency, an earthquake, etc. This ordinance goes far beyond the scope of that limited exemption and applies citywide and allows projects that may be built on contaminated sites, on endangered species habitat, or that may have air pollution or traffic concerns to go by right, including multifamily developments, including mixed-use developments, which means commercial and residential together, and it could be a shopping mall with a few residential developments on top. Those projects would become by right, especially if they're in a priority development area, and therefore avoid environmental review. There's already case law on this. After the Northridge earthquake, the city of Santa Clarita tried to do exactly the same thing. The court struck it down in a case called Castaic Lake versus Santa Clarita. And the court said the emergency exemption only applies to allowing you to rebuild, and we're entirely in favor of rebuilding fire damaged properties expeditiously without red tape and CEQA review, but not an ordinance like this one that essentially allows wholesale redevelopment of large swaths of the city that were completely unaffected by the fire without public review, without public involvement, without the normal hearing process that the public has become used to and is entitled to, and without environmental review to make sure that the environmental impacts are mitigated as required by law. Therefore, we urge the council to reject this ordinance, require CEQA review. It is simply not exempt. I would be happy to take any questions that the council may have.
Thank you. And I forgot to mention this is a public hearing and it was opened 3 minutes ago. Terry Shore, followed by Ann Seeley.
Good evening. Mayor Coursey, City Council members, staff, members of the public. My name is Terry Shore. I am the Regional Director for Greenbelt Alliance. And I would urge the City Council, if you're going to move forward with this ordinance, to narrow the entire ordinance to the PDAs in the downtown areas for both design review and by right development. I think that sends a signal to both the neighborhoods and to the developers and the city that that's where we want to move forward and give this a chance to work, could potentially revitalize the downtown, which is what we're all trying to do. And it's really better for everyone to do this kind of work in the areas that have already been designated for housing and development. It's better for public health, it's better for our environment, and probably better for the economy as well. So I urge you to do that if you are going to move forward with this tonight, and thank you for the discussion.
Thank you. Is Ann Seeley here? I don't see her. Dwayne DeWitt. Thank you, sir. And be followed by Peggy Hendricks. I don't think she's here either. Have at it.
Hello, my name is Dwayne DeWitt. I'm from Roseland. You're using the acronym PDA today, and it essentially is Roseland. That's the one big area that's been called out to be a priority development area. I went to MTC for a decade to ask for Sebastopol Road to be a PDA. The city planners and others have decided all of Roseland should be a PDA. What I've brought today is the EIR from the Southwest Area Plan from 25 years ago. The reason I brought it is because it was inadequate at that time, and people pushed and said, hey, we need to do something. Staff at that time didn't want to. I do not believe we should be giving so much power to staff, especially when they make glib assertions about, oh, well, we're gonna work with the big projects. I want to read you what I said to the Planning Commission 2 years ago about the Redwood Gospel Mission project that was coming over to Roseland. At that time, we pointed out the Sebastopol Road Urban Vision Plan was outdated. The Roseland plan that was being put together had not addressed many of the issues that the community wanted to talk about, including the Redwood Gospel Mission. The plan was essentially a broad brush that was going on with the staff generalizing about what the community wants. And so we're saying here tonight that the community wants an expedited, streamlined development process for housing in the areas where fires were affected. This is what's really important here. You're making such a large leap. I'm asking you to continue this item. There needs to be a community discussion. Essentially, just don't hand it over to staff and say, well, you know what? Our zoning administrator is going to know how to work with you. And I know that appeals don't go forward from Roseland because they do cost too much. And I know from personal experience that staff is really glib and just brushes you off. You know, this whole situation of saying, oh, it's all going to be good and we'll work together does not happen. I can tell you that. I am one that bird-dogged the Redwood Gospel Mission to get it out into the public. So what I want to have happen here is you folks at the council exert your authority. You're our elected officials. Please do not give your power over to a staff member. And please do not cut the public out of this process. This is very important to the people that live in Roseland, which is where this is going to have its biggest footprint. Please continue the item. Please have an environmental impact review done. This is not something that should be exempt from CEQA. This is something we should embrace for CEQA and say, let's really look into it, because you're going to try to put so much stuff over in my neighborhood, which is already the most disadvantaged, underserved, and...
Thank you, Mr. DeWitt.
It's my pleasure, sir. Thank
Liz
you.
Brinsel. Is Liz here? Ananda Sweet. And it's left. Laura Magnus-Daughter. Brian Ling. And Brian will be followed by Peter Rumble.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. First of all, thank you for continuing the agenda tonight despite the earlier recess. This has been kicked down a couple of meetings already, and I'd hate to see it again, so thank you for continuing the agenda tonight. We are here again to support the ordinance, encourage your support of the ordinance. The discussion that's I haven't heard for the last hour and a half is a solution for our housing crisis. We have hundreds of concerns that everyone has. Nobody's bringing a solution. We had a housing crisis before the fire. Before the fire, we had a housing crisis. We need a solution. If we're gonna keep doing the same thing, we're gonna get the same result. And we keep talking about hypothetical examples. I got a hypothetical example. Let's don't pass this. Let's don't do anything. And a year from now, we'll have no improvement. 2 years, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years. We'll have done nothing to try to resolve our housing crisis. It's time to get some of these terms in place, get some of the process reduced, give staff some latitude to get some things done, cut the process where we can without violating laws, and get some things done. It's time to do this. This fire's kicked us in the butt, and we had the problem before. So please, let's show that the status quo process is no longer our solution to the housing crisis, and it's time to do something different. Thank you.
Peter Rumble.
Thank you. Peter Rumble from the Santa Rosa Metro Chamber. I do want to echo the thanks first for staff for diligently working on this, and for the council for hanging in there and hearing it tonight. I want to note Councilmember Sawyer's comment. He's absolutely right. This is the process that we're used to. What I want to say is that that doesn't mean it's the process we should have. That doesn't mean it's the right process or the best process. Indeed, I think that what we have now is a product of very hard-fought battles against sprawl, in our community that tamped down really restricted development. And, you know, in many ways, kudos, because we have wonderful natural resources and regulations that protect our natural resources. But the context has changed. We have a general plan, we have urban growth boundaries, we have community separators. We have a system now that provides many of those same checks, but we have a development and entitlement process that is completely out of line with current reality. Mr. Ling is absolutely right. We have a housing crisis exacerbated by the fires, and I know that you are very well aware of that. I want to be clear that housing isn't built in the community, and I've talked with many developers, many investors over the time that I've been both in the county and now even more so in the chamber. Housing isn't built because the process is too lengthy, too costly, and too risky, period. Just period. And we need to take action to resolve that. And if we aren't serious about resolving the housing crisis, then we can absolutely kick the can down the road and do nothing, and that's fine. But we got to realize that from Mary's to Medtronic, we need housing. We need workforce housing. We are at the Chamber doing everything that we can to support our workforce in the school system, as well as now providing employer-based child care services, and working with employers to deal with that critical need. What we need from the city, what we need from your council, is to take action to turn that tap open and to bring in investment, to make it attractive to build housing, to make it affordable to build housing. And you know, just to address a comment, will it change the face of the city? You know, I kind of doubt it, but right now the face of the city is no housing for you. So if it does change the face, you know, that might be a good thing. So thank you very much. I really appreciate your consideration. I know that this is difficult.
That's all the cards I have. Does anybody else want to address the council on this issue? I'll close the public hearing, bring it back to the council. Ms. McLean, could you address the statement that this provides some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card on CEQA for projects that otherwise would not be available?
I will do my best, Mayor. First, let me say the CEQA exemptions that are cited, I think well stated in the staff report, are specific to this ordinance. That's the CEQA evaluation that we are looking at with respect to the adoption of this ordinance as the project. What this ordinance doesn't do is eliminate any CEQA requirement that would otherwise happen with a discretionary review process. And my understanding, based on what Ms. Jones has shared with us earlier, is there are very few instances where we're actually creating a use as of right, meaning that there is no discretionary review required. In those cases, those are ministerial. As I said earlier, CEQA does not require ministerial actions by an agency to be reviewed under CEQA. Discretionary approval, even a minor use permit or a minor design review, however, still are discretionary approvals that would require us to look at CEQA. We do that on a regular basis. Many times there are appropriate exemptions, sometimes there aren't. We evaluate each project as it comes through. Nothing in this ordinance will change that process.
Thank you. Mr. Guin, just so we're all on the same page, would you describe very generally what the PDAs are in Santa Rosa?
And actually, I'll have Jessica do that. We have a map, and so we can talk through it.
Yeah, and I've got it on here.
I can put it up on the screen.
Yeah, and we actually have a thumb drive here. We can put it up on the screen.
So while you do that, if I could ask for just some clarification. So the direct quote that I wrote down from the public comment was, when a project is by right, CEQA is waived.
Well, technically, if the project is by right, we call that under CEQA, it's called ministerial, meaning that you have a, for example, you have a residential lot, you want to build a single family house, there is no discretionary review, you go into a building department, you submit appropriate plans, those are reviewed, you're given a building permit. There's no CEQA review on ministerial actions of a government agency. So, that's what I think he was trying to say.
So if we could, just to make sure I understand it a little bit better. So agriculture employee housing of 7 or more residents, without this streamlining to by right, would that have to do CEQA?
If it did not require any other discretionary approval, if it required a minor design review approval and it was by right land use, but yet design review, minor design review was required, that's still a discretionary approval for that project.
And so even with this streamlining as a by right, it would still have to get CEQA?
Again, you would have to look at the particular project and the land use designation and what that would require under the ordinance, and I would defer to Ms. Jones on that detail.
But what I'm trying to parse out here,
yes.
I hear two separate things that I'm trying to figure out. So if something required CEQA before, will it still require CEQA, or does this actually make it so that areas that would have had to have gone through this process will now no longer have to go through this process?
Under the ordinance, this ordinance basically takes a review process and brings it down a level. In a few instances, as my understanding, in a few instances, this ordinance will allow certain development projects without discretionary review. Those are single family houses in a planned development. There's an existing child care facility that wasn't making any external changes, and there are mobile home parks in a zoned area for mobile home parks. It's been my discussion with Ms. Jones that there are still some level of discretionary review required for other projects. So there may be some instances where it eliminates CEQA analysis, but it's very limited.
So then I guess the particular question, I know we just got this letter, right? I think it came through our email while we were in closed session earlier, so I know you haven't had a chance to really look at it, but that seems to be the court case that is cited, Castic Lake Water Agency versus City of Santa Clarita. If it does, in fact, regardless of how many instances that's the case, waive the requirement for CEQA on projects that otherwise would have had to have gone through it, does that open us up to liability?
Well, and that's one exemption. There are other exemptions that are cited in the staff report, including 15183, where there's consistency already with a general plan that rely on the existence of a previous EIR that was approved and certified for the general plan. And there's also that because a project still requires discretionary review. So I would say, I don't think that there's a problem there, and I think there were other CEQA exemptions that would apply to, for example, a single family residence already has an exemption under CEQA, so.
Right, and just they walk through, it's not just one instance that they walk through.
I've reviewed it. I haven't had a chance to review every case that they've cited and do additional research, but I think that the premise is flawed to the extent that we aren't creating a plethora of exemptions under CEQA. We're simply not saying that things are or are not exempt under CEQA. There may be certain limited cases where we are permitting certain uses, and I think I listed them, maybe there's correction, but by right in those limited areas. But we're looking at the CEQA exemptions that are cited for the ordinance as a whole.
So let me jump then. So the real question becomes, in terms of liability and where the city sits legally, would be on the interpretation by staff, not necessarily on the crafting of the ordinance. So what I mean by that is, if you're saying that there's very limited instances where this might come up, where CEQA might not be required under this ordinance, if we were to come back later and find out that your legal analysis or a court case said that we did in fact have to do that, it wouldn't be necessarily throwing out the whole ordinance. It would just be a clarification that things that required CEQA before will still require CEQA. Is that correct?
Well, I think that's somewhat speculative. I think that any potential challenge would challenge the entire ordinance, and then there would be a lot of argument about the impact of that. So I don't know exactly what the outcome would be, but I think that what I think is more important, though, is that we've prepared our CEQA analysis for the ordinance as a whole, and I don't think that the intent was to piecemeal that, and that the arguments in the letter really, I think, interpreted this ordinance and its impact much more broadly than is really the case.
So and just to clarify, the uses that are identified as being potentially allowed by right, again, most of those would continue to require minor design reviews. So for example, duplexes, multifamily dwellings, residential components of a mixed-use project, all of those would require design review, which is a discretionary permit, which would trigger the CEQA analysis. So what we'd be looking at is single-family dwellings in a planned development district. We have some planned development districts that require them to obtain a use permit. This is bringing it down to allowed by right, and single-family dwellings are exempt from the design review process, so those would not go through the CEQA process. Mobile home parks, my understanding is they do not require design review, so that is one, but again, it would be for mobile home parks in the mobile home park district that is specifically set aside for that. For the other uses like large family daycare, community care facilities, if they are going into an existing structure where they are not, it's a new use going into an existing structure that is not requiring any exterior changes or development of a new structure, then it would be by right, it would just be the use. If it is requiring exterior changes, it is proposing to build a new structure for that use, then it would trigger the design review process, which again is discretionary.
Thank you. PDAs.
Yeah, so the map before you shows the various planned development areas in the city of Santa Rosa, and we have 6 of them. So there is the Mendocino Avenue corridor, the Santa Rosa Avenue corridor, the Sebastopol Road corridor, and then the 3 specific plan areas, which is the North Santa Rosa Stationary Specific Plan, the Downtown Stationary Specific Plan, and the Roseland Area Specific Plan.
Thank you. Any other questions at this time?
If I may, through the mayor. So my suggestion regarding the specific, the PDAs, the priority development areas, it's my understanding that, and correct me, that the North Station and the downtown station areas on these both had rigorous public comment and input. I recall those meetings. We also have a downtown core, which I thought went over to Brookwood. Is the downtown core not included on this map?
So this map is just showing the PDA areas. You are correct. The boundaries of the downtown as described and shown in our general plan is slightly different than the downtown stationary plan. Encompasses most of it, but there is a small section to the east that is not included in the downtown stationary plan.
So part of that is historic, but part of it is not. Did we have as extensive a process along the Sebastopol Road?
So the portion of the Sebastopol Road corridor that
is it in reddish?
Yeah, so yeah, the area that's, I guess it's kind of a purpley color there. There's about half of that corridor on the eastern side is also within the Roseland PDA area, and so that area was analyzed in the Roseland specific plan, and there was extensive outreach done with that process. So I would say, and there was also extensive outreach done with the corridor plans that were developed for Mendocino Avenue and Santa Rosa Avenue. So really the only area that has not been looked at in too much detail is the portion of the Sebastopol Road corridor that is to the west of
the blue line?
Of Stony Point Road.
So I would be comfortable if we included the areas where we have had robust community conversation. So that would, I guess that would involve the removal of the area east of Stony Point, west of Stony Point Road. If we're looking at this within that context, my initial take on it was do the North Station and the downtown station area, but what I'm hearing you say is that we had sufficiently robust public input for the other pieces of the PDA with the exception of the area west of Stony Point Road. And I would have included the full downtown core, but am I hearing that we didn't have a discussion to Brookwood? We didn't really include that area in the discussion.
Yeah, so the boundaries of the downtown station area specific plan were drawn based on a half-mile radius around the SMART station, right. And so that was a little bit further beyond, and so the MTC designated this area as a PDA, and so that's where the boundaries of the specific plan were.
So I'm aware that the Mendocino Avenue corridor plan has had some issues associated with the implementation. For example, the plan asked that certain structures face the road rather than not face the road, but be face sideways to the main road. Was that process, did that go through the full, let me ask specifically about the culinary center across from the junior college. My understanding is that it doesn't fully meet the standards of the Mendocino Avenue corridor plan as discussed by the neighbors and the citizens of Santa Rosa. How is it? Is that because it's a state-owned building, or is that because of a process that we went through?
Yeah, so that is owned by the junior college, and it being a school does not have to go through the discretionary process through the city.
Okay, so that clarifies that concern. Thank you. So I'm somewhat reluctant to include all of Roseland because of their newness to our area, all of the blue area, but I can be persuaded.
Mr. Tibbetts, you have this item. Do you want to take a stab at a motion?
I do.
And get us moving here?
I have one question before I do that, though, and that is, just as an example, I'm trying to get an understanding of square footage. What is the square footage of a project the size of, for example, what City Ventures is proposing to do?
Which project for City Ventures?
Oh yeah, good question. The one in Fountain Grove is 218 units, I think, being proposed. Is the rule of thumb generally 1,000 square feet per unit?
Yeah, so one thing I would clarify is that the 10,000 square feet is based on total project size. So even if it's, a project has multiple smaller buildings, we would look at the total square footage. So it's not per building. So if
right, that's what I'm trying to understand is, so for example, if I'm going to apply a cap to 060, am I talking 100,000, 200,000, Because what I'm recognizing here, guys, is that we've asked you to solve our housing problem. And you've come to us with what is clearly your idea, because no member of council put this forward, and you're asking us to support this idea to help you be successful. And I want to do that. So I don't want to throw in an arbitrary number for the sake of throwing it in there. I want to make sure that what you have here is powerful and is going to empower you to help us achieve our city's objectives. So is there a kind of a number for something significant in your mind, Director Guin? What would give you the latitude?
There's already 10,000 square feet in one section of this.
No, and I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, are you looking at a square footage to modify the 10,000 in there that triggers the preliminary design review?
My understanding is you got 070 on one side, correct, a 10,000 square foot cap to trigger the design review.
Correct.
On the 060 side, there is no trigger. What I see there is we're doing by right for anything that comes to your counter. And I'm hearing you say that you will use your discretion, and I know that you will appropriately, but you're saying you'll use your discretion to kick things to design review if they seem too large and too significant and there's too much controversy. And so what we got to do, I think, is drill down on a number that might exist in your mind or may not, that allows you to be effective in what you're trying to do here, but gives the zoning code specification.
Yeah, and unfortunately at this time, it'd be hard to speculate what that is. And I think just to make sure it's clear that if something gets bumped from by right, it would go to a minor design review. I'm sorry, it would be a minor use permit. So again, that would be, yeah, I apologize. I can't give you a number off the top of my head that would trigger that. I think one of the things I'm hearing is potentially taking the 06, which is the use permit side, and restricting that to these areas that were shown on the map and not doing the whole city. So that's one potential way of putting a boundary on it. But to come up with a square footage, I couldn't do that off the top of my head. I apologize.
Okay.
On what would be realistic for.
Does shrinking it to those zones empower you to do your job? I mean, I'm really trying to support you guys here. And, you know, if we need to go with this, I'm willing to go with this. But I just think that I'm trying to help some of my colleagues in their questions, which frankly I share. I'm just erring on the side of, you know what, we are living in a very difficult time, and the fallout for the secondarily displaced people after this fire in the next 3 years is going to be huge. And I want to make sure that you've got the tools that you need to stave that off.
So I think, you know, in hearing the concerns and hearing from the public and talking to people over the past couple of weeks, I think the boundaries that are up here, I think from a standpoint that this is a temporary, it's 3 years, we want to try this. Again, this isn't in a silo, this isn't by itself. We spent 3 hours with you last week talking about all the other elements that we're trying to move forward at the same time with density bonus and specific plan updates and inclusionary policies. And so we're not going to let up. I think this is one part of this overall package that we have to address to try to solve this housing crisis. So I think if what we're hearing, I think if we take and confine this to this area for the entire policy, I think that's definitely a start, and we can see how that works. We can track it. We can give you information about how that's actually working. And if we find, I think to Councilmember Sawyer's point, if we find that we're hearing, well, wait a minute, these projects are being backed up and they're affordable projects and it's not working, we'll bring that back to the council and have that conversation. So I'd answer that question. I think to narrow this down, to provide some focus, to provide some assurance to the council that we're going to focus on these areas and we're going to try to hit transit areas in our downtown. That's what I'd recommend at this point.
Okay. I move an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Rosa amending Title 20 of the Santa Rosa City Code, adding sections 20-16.060 through 20-166 .090 to Chapter 20-16, Resilient City Development Measures to address housing needs and economic development within the city of Santa Rosa following the Tubbs and Nuns fires of October 2017, file number REZ 17-013, and waive further reading of the text.
Second. And I'd like to make an amendment, if that's possible, as a friendly amendment, that the provisions regarding the PDAs applied to .060, .070, and .080, that it covered the full document for the PDAs.
I'll accept that amendment.
Thank you.
I have a question. Ms. McLean, my understanding is that the council cannot waive appeal fees. Is that correct?
Well, my recommendation would be that it be done on a global basis. I mean, there is, because it's a reduction.
Case by case basis.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, if the appeal fee is a concern, I think the recommendation could come from the council that it be eliminated. Again, it's because it's not an increase. We don't have a special requirement for notices before we adopt increased fees. We would have to do that. But in this case, we wouldn't have to, because if it's a waiver for a temporary period of time, that could be allowed.
Okay. I'm going to suggest that we cut those fees by 50% and ask that be a friendly amendment as well.
I'm sorry, I was, can we actually do that per Prop 218 and 29? I mean, isn't that a fee schedule tied to a nexus for a fee for service?
Well, actually, the appeals fee in this case is a processing fee, so it's a fee to cover staff time. The Planning and Economic Development Department is, has a recovery methodology for its fees, but I don't understand it to be 100% recovery. So that's basically a general fund kind of backfill on budget. Any loss that would be come out of the budget of the department because of that fee waiver. I would also mention, while not necessarily a legal issue, you could see a lot more appeals, so then the impact on staff could be greater than just waiving or halving the fee. So.
Right, and I would hope that would be tracked as along with the other tracking that's reporting back to the council on this as well.
May I ask for clarification? Did you suggest that it be on a sliding scale based on the applicant, or did you ask that it be half?
I asked that it be half. I think that putting it on a sliding scale probably increases the staff time.
Yeah, I just was trying to figure out if you were saying half for some people or half altogether.
So, Mr. Mayor, I'm going to just do a flat 300. Is that okay?
Sure.
Thanks.
Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I also would like to offer a friendly amendment to remove under .060 sections 4, 5, and 6, the emergency shelter sections, in particular, because if we are limiting this ordinance into just the PDAs, they are limiting the emergency shelters into areas that already have homeless services and continue to consolidate those services into those areas.
So I'm not going to accept that friendly amendment with respect, Mr. Vice Mayor. But what I would propose in its place was adding language to, I forget which section, I don't have it in front of me, but for the residential emergency shelter, up to 10 residents. I don't want to see any ambiguity there. So would you second that, Councilwoman Combs?
If I can understand, the request is that if an emergency shelter is going into a residential area, it would have no more than 10 residents served. Is there a reason to have that particular number, or do we have another number for a limitation on?
Again, what I'm trying to do.
I remember a number like 15 from another conversation. That's why I'm asking why we're.
15 might be fine. I think it's important to apply a number to this particular area, because you might have residents who do not have cars but would have obviously a huge
Will have an impact on a neighborhood,
yeah.
on a residential neighborhood.
And that would be true of any citizen, any 15 people in a single family.
Family care homes often have only 6, so I'm trying to figure out the number that is reasonable to apply. Do you have a suggestion?
So the concern that I have is that while we talk about homelessness being a citywide issue, what we're really doing is making it so that the barriers for services continue to be in just one location of our city, as opposed to having a solution that would be better served citywide. That's my concern with it, is we've,
I see what you're saying, it would get limited to the priority development areas that we're confining this to, but I've got to say that with the magnitude of this issue that we're trying to get our arms around, this is a tool that I'm unwilling to get rid of. And it's a valuable tool, and I'll tell you, in my experience with the Armory, the ability to shelter 90 people every night and get by right access into that space was really important.
Well, I'm perfectly happy to consider that citywide, if you'd like to consider that aspect citywide, but I think if you talk to the people who are in the downtown core, people who are in the West End, people who are in Roseland, those are the poorest areas of the city to begin with, and that's where the services are consolidated. And I think that it could be construed that we are forcing services into an over-concentrated area already, instead of actually asking the rest of the city to shoulder the burden as well.
I'm happy to if we can extend that one little provision citywide, I'm happy to do that. I completely agree with that argument. It's all of our
So if I may just understand as the second, isn't it already possible to do by right shelters throughout our city based on our homeless emergency declaration, or is that only the...
It's conditional use.
Is that only conditional use? I'm hearing.
We can verify, but I believe it's temporary shelters for duration, so it's not a permanent shelter.
Are temporary shelters defined in terms of 3 years?
I don't know the term. Actually, typically our temporary policies are a year and with renewals.
Can you answer the question that was raised about whether we can make this one portion of the ordinance citywide while we limit the rest?
So yeah, so another option would be to go back to the use permit 06, the use permit section that's citywide, and then use that to remove the ones you don't want, and we can keep. Are there other elements of that section that you're okay with, or do you want to just talk about homeless shelters? Because we could keep that section essentially and just leave the elements you want and remove. Because right now in there is like multifamily housing. The other aspect of this, multifamily housing and which would still need the, it'd have to be zoned for that, and you would have to go through the preliminary design review to do that. But that's in there as well.
To be clear, I'm in agreement with Vice Mayor Rogers on this. If we can somehow separate out section 4, 5, and 6, and out of the whole ordinance make that apply citywide, or maybe we need to take it out now with the promise that you bring it back in a week as a separate standalone ordinance, but to me that's a really important piece of what this is.
And that was more or less what my motion was to remove sections 4, 5, and 6. If you'd like to discuss them at a different time, I'm happy to have that conversation more globally, but...
Well, I don't want to lose the opportunity here.
I understand, but...
As the seconder, I don't have a problem with the expansion to citywide if we can figure out that language.
Okay, so if we bring it back with 4, 5, and 6, separated out citywide with the language as it's written here.
Can that be done at the second reading? Okay.
Yes.
I have another question here, Mr. Sawyer.
15 is fine.
I'm needing some clarification on what Councilmember Combs' friendly amendment does to this ordinance. And then I have a question. A second question, follow-up question.
It's basically just so my understanding is, from what I'm hearing, is that the recommendation on the table now is to have section 4, 5, and 6 of the use permit for emergency shelters apply citywide, not just to the confines of the boundaries listed up here on the screen, which are the PDAs.
I believe he's asking, what does my inclusion of .070 and .080 do by including them in the PDA piece, or the...
So I think what I heard was that the direction is to require each of these sections, perhaps with the exception of the emergency shelters, it would be confined to projects just within these planned development areas only. And so that would apply to the design review reduction, and then also to changes to approved residential and lodging projects. So only projects that are located within these PDA areas could utilize this ordinance.
And so when, Mr. Guin, when you made a recommendation that would be an acceptable modification to the ordinance, when I'm concerned, and then I'm going to ask you for some guesswork, and what kind of effect what will this do to the efficacy of this ordinance in restricting it in that way? Because that's my concern.
Yeah, it is being restricted, and I think that's to be seen. The element that is being left off the table, which we brought forward, was affordable housing. So the thought was that we would focus the primary market rate projects that apply to this, that are eligible for this, be focused in these PDAs, unless it's affordable. And if it's affordable, inclusionary, on-site, which we're struggling to get, and we really want to see more of that in our community, apply that citywide, similar to the conversation you're having about the shelters. And so that's what we brought forward.
Sorry, I want to be clear on this because that's an important part. By right, if I'm a developer and I bring forward 15% inclusionary, I can develop by right outside the PDA.
You would be able to be eligible for to go through the zoning administrator and not through the full process. It would be a much quicker process. You'd still have the preliminary design review process to go through to get feedback, and then we would incorporate that into our action to move those affordable housing, inclusionary affordable housing projects through quicker.
So this change, or the reduction in the breadth of this ordinance, does not so eviscerate the effort that it becomes a useless tool. I think what I'm wondering is, what I'm concerned about is that we will be eviscerating it, and the whole idea, this is not going to solve our housing issues in Santa Rosa. This is a tool that we would be able to use, but it clearly is not going to solve our housing problem. So given that it's not going to solve the housing problem, if we so eviscerate this ordinance that it doesn't even do what the original intention was, then why bother at all? So that's what I'm asking for, is I'm trying to support this, but there's a part of me that wants to vote against it because it doesn't do the job.
Mm-hmm. So the part that would be removing based on the discussion was the affordable housing component. So essentially what we brought forward to you in this ordinance was confined for design review to these areas with affordable housing citywide, and then the use by right and the use layer citywide. By restricting the use permit to just these areas, it would definitely restrict primarily probably the daycare discussion, and that was a big discussion after the fires, that we felt a strong sense from the community that was lost, and that was keeping people from going back to work, and we heard a lot of comments about that. That's what we wanted to try to address citywide and not just focus in the PDAs. So that would be off the table. But we're trying this out, and what we're trying to do is find what will make the council feel comfortable that this is something that they could support, provide you some feedback. But I would suggest that if we shrink it anymore or start taking any more out, I think we get to the point where it becomes not a very useful tool, and we probably won't see much come from it. So I think the question on the table, I just want to make sure that the entire council is aware that where it is right now is it would eliminate the affordable housing inclusionary citywide through the design review process. And that's something I just want to make sure is clear for everybody.
The conversation we haven't had about the 15%, which we can bring back and have that conversation and then expand those items into this ordinance if we so choose. But right now we haven't had the conversation about what that means.
So, so the 15% is our current inclusionary policy, and as you mentioned, we're going to be—
We also haven't done the reduction of parking, the increased building height. I mean, we had a number of items that we as a council moved forward for the HAP that somehow didn't come before this item. And so I'm hesitating at the level I am hesitating because we haven't had the other conversations. I won't hesitate after we've had those other conversations to be willing to do some expansion. But priority development areas are also designated by us, by our planning department, as the areas where we want to see the development because it's transit-oriented, because of the location of those. So I think it's appropriate for us to focus on the housing in the priority development areas.
Mr. Tibbetts.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just kind of want to respond to Councilman Sawyer because I'm leaning the same way where, again, going back to what I said before, they've given us an idea of what they need to be successful based on what we've asked them to do. And I'm really hesitant to try to curtail that at all. And so on the one hand, I think, and this is as much a question for all of you, is this an option? We more or less approve the ordinance as is brought to us, but we go year to year. It's a 3-year ordinance, but we revisit it every year and have the opportunity to review it, rescind it, and look at its efficacy or unintended consequences. That's one area that I'm leaning. Another is I actually really do like what we've kind of fashioned here tonight. You've got, in that huge part of town, which is a focus of this council, market rate development by right. And on all the surrounding areas, you have by right development with a 15% affordability inclusion. That's also a pretty good map. I think whatever direction we choose to move forward with tonight is an incredible step in the direction of creating housing in Santa Rosa. And I don't think anybody in this community would fault us for making a bad decision tonight based on either issue we've talked about.
Mr. Guerin, do you want to comment on the year-to-year idea? I appreciated your comment on the last question about the efficacy of this, and if you could kind of give us your same feeling or your same reaction.
I think we could definitely entertain that. I'm thinking through the process of bringing something back to council to have this conversation. Just in terms of time, I think it would be. Let me just can I confer 1 second?
Sure.
Okay, so I think there are a couple options. I guess it is an interesting discussion. We could adopt it for 3 years and bring back every year to have a potential rescind the ordinance if it's not working. That's one option. The other option is to adopt it year by year and come back each year and ask the council to bring this policy forward. So I would, again, from the standpoint of the time and again, taking time on staff to try to get things done, I would recommend that we check in with information along the way, but have a time every year where the council could rescind this at any time, but we would make it a formal item.
If I could, I think that's important because we are giving staff an inordinate amount of control over this process, and we're the ones entrusted to defend the public interest. And I think it was Mr. Rumble mentioned we need to turn on the spigot. Well, if that's the case, I think the council should definitely have its hands on the spigot at all times, and that's what this helps us do. So what I'd like to do is, for the first wave of voting, is rescind my motion, and I'd like to take this as you've presented it, with 10 or fewer beds in section 4 for the residential, a 1/2 appeal fee that the mayor requested, and I will leave it at that.
So for clarification, so it is no longer, your motion is no longer having it targeted into the PDAs?
Well,
I can't second.
070 is still PDAs, and is that correct?
070 is PDAs or inclusionary and affordable on-site 15%.
Yep.
I'm sorry, I can't leave my second with that.
I've already made the second.
Question, Mr. Sawyer?
Thank you, Mayor. Perhaps it's really for Councilmember Tibbetts and those that are concerned about moving forward or about blessing this for 3 years. If the reports were fairly comprehensive, which is pretty rare that we get monthly reports on something like this, it will probably not be, I'm not sure what kind of work that's going to take. Depends on what kind of response we get to this kind of incentive. Would not the monthly reports give us, and having the hands on the spigots, would that not give us the necessary control over this ordinance that we would need to make adjustments ultimately, or eliminate it, enhance it, whatever it might be? I would think the monthlies would handle the annual review. That sounds problematic to me, and I would think that would take care of it. Does that not resonate with the council? A monthly review?
Mr. Rogers.
I mean, just to kind of make it comical almost how we're doing this, I actually agree with Councilmember Sawyer about not necessarily doing it year to year, but doing the 3 years that was originally proposed. But there's a level of discomfort that comes with any of this. I was comfortable enough to move with it targeted into the PDAs, but probably not comfortable enough with it to be brought across the city. So kind of with you, kind of with you.
Actually, we have a motion and a second. After a question, I'm going to call the vote. Sure, go ahead.
So as you read the ordinance and where we're here, because I know all 7 of us, we're trying to do what we can do to support you, and I think Councilmember Tibbetts might have mentioned it too, so you come forward with this, and you've been listening to us all along, and we're trying to craft it, and we come back and we give you a little bit more feedback. And I had a conversation this week with a community member who says, this development is death by 1,000 cuts. And we just are demonstrating this, we're modeling this. We're gonna tweak this, where it's gonna get difficult to do anything here. And for me, it's like, we've gotta take some risk. And I trust our staff, you guys are awesome. And so we've given you some direction. We're trying to get more housing. Yes, this is outside the burn area, but it's for the whole city because the whole city needs more housing. And if we don't take some risks, we're never gonna change our status here. So you guys have come through with your professional opinions that this may work, hearing what we have to say. I think we have to take some risks and go forward. Like you said, Mr. Guin, that if we want to change this in a couple months, we get it on the agenda, we can change it all. And again, this death by 1,000 cuts, I think we have to be bold and let's try something. I trust that you guys will understanding what we're saying, what's good for the community. Let's go forward. So I'm supportive of what we got here before us today. Let's make some difference here.
Mr. Mayor.
Mr. Oliveras.
Thank you. we are not in a housing crisis, and if we're going to be bold, we need to be bold. And I do agree, it's a risk. I know it's uncomfortable to sometimes give up control, but we do have a lot of work to do. We've made some significant changes over the years, and the staff has done nothing to make me lose confidence in their abilities to plan things and move things forward. And I also want to ensure that there's some certainty for those who are going to be doing the building. I mean, for them to be able to go year to year, I don't think that works for them. I think they need to have some certainty on what's going to happen in the future. So keeping it just little steps, I don't think is adequate enough, but I'm comfortable though with having the monthly check-ins on how progress is going so that we still have some sense of control. But I agree, I do support the ordinance in its entirety, not in the way it's been presented now, but we need to move on this and get going and demonstrate that we're serious about building. Thank you.
Any further comments? Ms. Combs.
Well, there's a reason that we selected priority development areas in the first place, and that was because we wanted to target them for development. And it seems to make a lot of sense to me that areas that we've had a lot of public comment, a lot of predictability for our residents in, that we choose PDAs for moving forward with all of these elements. I appreciate that folks are concerned about, for example, the shelters. I personally think we took care of that with the emergency shelter ordinance, but I understand that we can pull that out. I liked that we had come to that conclusion. Like my colleague, I would have preferred to go ahead and do this for 3 years rather than year by year within the PDAs, because we targeted the PDAs for development. There's a reason we chose them. I'm very uncomfortable with subjecting our residents to the level of unpredictability that this is going to create for them. And I have to admit, I still have some CEQA related questions. I have supported our DRB processes, and I appreciate that. I don't think we've solved the problem with the conceptual level here. We have a lot of housing action plan programs to come forward. I would rather we were bringing our housing action plan forward than repeating this conversation 3 times. So I can't support this motion.
Mr. Rogers.
Yeah, I'll be really brief. I've had a lot of questions, and I've been looking for a way to get to yes and figuring out how do we create housing, and challenging myself to even move in a direction where there's a substantial amount of discomfort for me. I am willing to do that in the PDAs as a way to see how it would work and to familiarize the community with it. I'm willing to do it for 3 years and actually evaluate it. The ordinance as it's written now, I'm really struggling to figure out how to get on board with it. The PDAs, as was stated, is an area that has had a lot of talk about this is where we want housing, this is where we want development. The community has had that robust conversation, and I know we are bringing forward other elements to try to streamline the process. I think that this ordinance scapegoats our design review board for a process that is death by 1,000 cuts. And I would like to see some reforms to it. I would like to see some further reforms that we know are coming, height limit, additional resources to help assist, whether it's a housing bond or whether it's a renewal enterprise district. I want to see all of that, and I want to figure out how the council can strike that sweet spot between being a little bit uncomfortable and actually doing something productive. To me, this just is probably too broad.
Would you restate your motion, please?
The Council of the City of Santa Rosa, amending Title 20 of the Santa Rosa City Code, adding sections 20-16.060 through 20-16.090 to Chapter 20-16, Resilient City Development Measures to address housing needs and economic development within the City of Santa Rosa following the Tubbs and Nuns fires of October 2017, file number REZ 17-013, including amendments of 1/2 of the appeal fee, limit up to 10 10 people in residential for emergency shelters. And that is it. That's what I had.
We had a second Mr. Oliveros.
Oh, no, sorry, and the year by year. The year by year is the third one.
The year by year to revisit or to, would it take a rescission of the ordinance or a renewal each year?
A renewal.
A renewal each year.
Mm-hmm. I think we have to monitor this closely as it moves forward.
I think what we could do is add like a review provision in the ordinance that says on an annual basis that staff will bring this back to council for consideration. I don't know if it will have a recommendation on an action other than to just consider it, but it will at least call the question to council.
All right.
That's fine.
You're good with that? Mm-hmm. Your votes?
I hate to do this to you. The appeal fee, just it's half. There's two appeal fees. There's an applicant appeal fee and the public neighborhood appeal fee. The $300 for the person from the neighborhood is what we heard, but the applicant appeal fee is about $3,000. It's quite a bit more. So I just want to make sure you're just talking about the neighborhood appeal fee and leaving the other fees alone, or you want to address all fees.
When I brought it up, my intent was the neighborhood.
Okay, that's. I just want to make sure we're clear on that. Okay, thank you. If that's.
That passes with 5 ayes. Council members Combs and Rogers opposed. Thank you for all your work on this. Thanks everybody for your patience. We'll move on to our second of 4 public hearings. 15.2.
Item 15.2, public hearing authorizing submission of the 2016-2020 amended consolidated plan and fiscal year 2018-2019 action plan and approval of grant agreements for public services, fair housing, and housing opportunities for persons with AIDS. And we have Nancy Manchester, program specialist, presenting. I think.
So good evening, Mayor Corsi, members of the council. So the item before you tonight is a public hearing authorizing submission of the amended 2016 to 2020 consolidated plan, the fiscal year 2018-19 action plan to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, known as HUD, and approving grant agreements for public services, fair housing, and housing opportunity for persons with AIDS, also known as HOPWA. So in summary, the purpose tonight is to authorize the submission of the plans. The plans are required by HUD in order to receive Community Development Block Grant, Home Investments Partnership Act, and HOPWA grants, and for you to approve the grant agreements for public services, fair housing, and HOPWA. These are annual agreements. So the submission of the plans is typically done by May 15th. We have been instructed to submit it this year, 60 days after the funding allocations are announced by HUD, or August 16th, whichever comes first. And we were notified today that we have received our funding allocations for next year, and so we'll have to submit it by probably the end of June, which is 60 days from today. And I'm pleased to let you know that those funding allocations were increased this year by mostly a small amount. Our home allocation went up by about 47%, but the rest were all, 9, 5, 9, 10%. So the plans are required by HUD to have specific language and be updated with the actual allocations before we'll submit it. So we'll be doing that in the next couple of weeks. Your council goal for 2018 is to meet the community's housing needs, as Santa Rosa actively supports housing for all through protection, preservation, and production of housing. So the plans define exactly how the federal funds will be spent. That includes, again, CDBG, home, and HOPWA. The action plan covers 1 year, so the 18-19 fiscal year. The consolidated plan amends the previously approved 2016 to 2020 consolidated plan. So an amendment to the consolidated plan is required anytime a change of an eligible use of federal funds is considered, and we would like to consider using home funds for tenant-based rental assistance, affectionately known as TBRA, for low-income households, and to have that use considered, we have to demonstrate that market conditions would support the use, and we know that our average rents currently are quite high. They're higher than the high home rents that HUD sets every year. So the needs outlined in the plans are to increase the supply of affordable rental housing for the lowest income households, provide housing assistance and support services to low-income persons living with HIV or AIDS and their families, preserve existing affordable housing stock, and provide housing and services to special needs populations. The second tier of priorities would be to increase the access to homeownership opportunities, provide funding for public facilities or improvements, and promote economic development activities. So we've conducted a fair amount of outreach regarding the plans. We attended the CAB meeting in January. We had 2 community meetings in February. We've promoted this through social and traditional media and through Granicus Speak Up and through emails to opt-in lists. The plans were available for comment from March 19th to April 19th. The public comments that we've received to date were included in the draft plan, and any comments we receive tonight will be included in the plans prior to submission to HUD. So CDBG is approximately $1.3 million a year. We will be getting 1.4 this year. The purpose is to develop viable urban communities by providing decent housing, suitable living environment, and economic opportunities. It's principally for low and moderate income households, and a wide variety of activities are allowed so long as the above populations benefit. A maximum of 15% of CDBG is allowed for public services. HOPWA, we get approximately $400,000 a year, and it provides housing assistance and support services for low-income families living with HIV or AIDS. And home has approximately, in the past, been about $500,000 a year. We're getting about $700,000 this year. The purpose is to develop or rehabilitate affordable rental and ownership housing, acquisition, new construction, and reconstruction, moderate or substantial rehabilitation, homebuyer assistance, or TBRA for low-income households. Just as a note, the TBRA assistance moves with the client, similar to the way that the Section 8 program operates, and it can also assist with security deposits in addition to rent. So to teach the community a bit more about our public services funding, we had outreach meetings in February. Applications were due on March 7th, and the applications were reviewed by staff with Councilmember Olivares in March. And here are our recommendations. The target for public services is focused comprehensive homeless services through funding coordinated entry operations of facilities serving the homeless population. The funding available is $198,980, and we recommend continuing funding Catholic Charities for the Homeless Services Center and the Family Support Center. The main goal of Fair Housing Program is to implement the recommendations of the 2012 Analysis of Impediments to Fair Housing. The fiscal year funding for 2018-19 is about $36,000, and we recommend continuing to fund Fair Housing Advocates of Northern California, who, when they first came to us, were called Fair Housing of Marin, and they've rebranded since then. And HOPWA is for housing and support for low-income persons living with HIV, AIDS, and their families, with about $400,000, and recommend that Face-to-Face continue to be funded for that program. So it is recommended by the Housing and Community Services Department that the council, by resolution, authorize submission of the 2016 to 2020 amended consolidated plan and the fiscal year 2018-19 action plan to HUD. Approve the fiscal year 2018-19 grant agreements for public services, fair housing, and HOPWA, and authorize the city manager to execute the grant agreements with service providers, the annual federal funding agreements with HUD, and any additional forms or documents required by HUD to implement the 2016 to 2020 amended consolidated plan and the fiscal year 18-19 action plan. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Manchester. All of these programs got an increase in funds this year. Is that based on need or really good applications or across-the-board increases?
Yeah. HUD allocates the funds based on formulas that include population, income levels, and then also by the number of grantees throughout the country. And so the allocations can be higher or lower every year based on that formula.
Okay, so you never know until you get a call?
Right.
All right, thank you. Any other questions, Council? Yeah, Mr. Schwedhelm.
Actually, just on that last point about the funding, because historically I know we have been on the lower end of the COCs receiving funding. Can you share with me what's the difference between what our department, your department does versus the COC to try to increase that funding? In other words, the formula or letting, I think it was in 2016, we sent a letter to them asking, could you reevaluate the way the funding levels are going? What might be a strategy that we could maybe use to try to get additional funding to our community?
You're referring to the continuum of care having?
Well, I'm trying to understand the difference between housing and community services with the city of Santa Rosa, the continuum of care and these different funding streams that comes from HUD.
So the continuum of care's funding streams are made directly to the Sonoma County organization, and ours are made directly to the city of Santa Rosa. So the COC serves the entire county with the exception of the city of Santa Rosa and the city of Petaluma.
Actually, I think I can answer what you're asking. So on the funding that Nancy's talking about that's covered under a consolidated plan, that's because we are an entitlement city. So there's a whole stream of funding that goes to entitlement entities, and it is a formula based on your population, your low income, the criteria that HUD establishes, and in its entitlement across the country. When you look at the continuum of care, HUD developed a separate formula which initially was totally competitive. And what they have done on the continuum of care formula is it's a proportional share. And so based on your community's size and homeless counts and other data that they look at, they come up with a share that your continuum should have. So as long as you have eligible projects, you're pretty much eligible for that share. Then what they do for communities that did not have use up all their eligible share, they use that money, they pull it together, and they can award additional funding to continuums across the country. So one of the ways to increase your continuum share, you'll get your baseline, but if you have additional good, strong projects that are meeting HUD's priorities, then there is a second round of eligibility to get more in your continuum of care.
Okay, I think that might be a nice conversation with our ad hoc committee meeting with the city county too, as we look at the system redesign. So Nancy, I also had a question on the 2016-2020 amended consolidated plan that was part of the staff report. The data and some of the accomplishments were from 2009 through 2014.
That's correct.
At what point would we get some more current data?
When we do our next consolidated plan is when we would add updated data. The purpose of the amendment was only to add in the proposed additional use of home funds. And there's not a requirement from HUD that we update a lot of the data. There were places where I plugged in new numbers like population, for example, but most of it stayed as we reported, I believe it was 2 years ago when we adopted the original.
That would be helpful for me if we got some updated information, because there's some current stuff, and I have some questions too about the community outreach. And what would be really helpful on the one slide that showed the priorities A through D, if the accomplishments could parallel that. So if they're saying increase the supply of affordable rental housing for lowest income households, here's how we've been doing on it. Again, trying to get, it's helpful for me to see our efforts in this area, return on investment, is it being effective? And then now, since that one's up there too, I looked at the scope of services for the HOPWA funding. Where do we find the data about how that is working? Because on this, it talks about what their outcomes are, but I didn't see any data about how are they doing. Where would one find that for the HOPWA funding?
They report to us monthly, and we'd be happy to share that with the council.
Well, also for members of the public, not just us, is there some place like on a dashboard where we could take a look at saying, is this, you know, it's what, 500 some thousand, how is that investment?
Yeah. Typically, we do what's called a caper, and that's a look back at the accomplishments of the prior year. So our next caper would be due in September, and that's when we would look at the 16-17 year.
Yeah, it would just be helpful, whatever data we have for this, again, return on investment. So can you tell me a little bit more about the, I know we have the city's citizen participation plan. We had 2 community meetings. How many people showed up, and I didn't see any comments. You said they were embedded in here, so it's kind of difficult to find out what was being said and how many people participated in that process.
Well, the first community meeting we had, we did not have any attendance. The second one, we had 1 person. The comments we received was a letter from SAY, which was included in the draft plan. They were commenting about the use of public services funding to augment their homeless services for teenagers.
So I guess I would ask, and I'm sure the citizen participation plan, is the consolidated plan the only time this document gets used and this plan gets utilized?
It's a document that's required by HUD, so generally it only applies to these particular.
So I guess my point would be because I think that's kind of consistent, the amount of participation. This plan just describes, here's all the things we're gonna do. So we do all this, and then the end result is 2 people showed up, gave us feedback. I'm thinking we maybe need to change the plan. Whereas if the plan should say we want 100 people, 150 people to give us feedback about this, as we had earlier today, we had a lot of people talking about things, you know, that sharing their displeasure about the way things are with what some of these efforts are going to be assisting with. But yet when we're asking, give us how should we spend the money, we get 1 person showing up. That's a little bit of a disconnect. So I don't know what we need to do, or if community engagement is Office of Community Engagement is someone who could assist with this. But it just seems like this is where the work gets done, but yet not many people in the community are very aware of it. Okay, thanks.
Ms. Combs.
Thank you, and thank you, Councilmember Schwedhelm, for that last comment. I would also like to see the data from the fair housing contractor. I have asked for that previously, and I think I've gotten like 1 report that was not very clear, and then it dried up. And for example, are they doing testing? My understanding was one of the reasons we selected them was that they did a kind of testing. I'd like to know how much testing they're doing and what the results are of the testing. Are they prosecuting cases or bringing cases forward that involve fair housing issues, and which issues and how many in each category? And if there's any way with this item as well as the items mentioned by my colleague to get that data online.
I do have some information that Fair Housing submitted regarding testing, just a couple of brief anecdotes.
Yes, please.
Within Santa Rosa, they've had some instances of racial discrimination, particularly a Caucasian renter was told by a landlord that, let's see, her African-American male friends should not live there when they weren't even residents, but he did not have the same issue with Caucasian male friends. There's also some familial status issues where a potential renter with children was told that they only rented units to, ground floor units to families. And finally, there's been some disability discrimination as well, where a tester whose profile included a disability was told that the application process for residency was convoluted and could take 2 to 3 weeks, while a person who was not similarly described was told, oh, a couple of days. So it still exists, unfortunately, out there.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing the anecdotes, and I appreciate also that we're working to diminish those issues in our community, but I would like to receive data as well.
Further questions, council? This is a public hearing. I'll open the public hearing. Got a card from Megan Murphy. Is she still here?
She had to leave.
That's the only card I have. Is there anyone else in the audience who'd like to address the council on this issue? I'll close the public hearing. Mr. Oliveris, you have this item.
I move a resolution of the Council of the City of Santa Rosa authorizing submission of the 2016 to 2020 amended consolidated plan and fiscal year 2018-2019 action plan, and approving grant agreements for public services, for housing, and housing opportunities for persons with AIDS, and waive further reading of the text.
Second.
Your votes? That passes unanimously. Thank you, Ms. Manchester.
Thank you.
Ms. Hurtado, 15.3.
Item 15.3, public hearing, Yolanda rezoning, -376, 380, 386, and 414 Yolanda Avenue, city file number Res 17-011. And Jessica is Jessica Jones, not Bill Rose.
Thank you, Mayor Corsi and members of the council. The item before you is a request to rezone 4 properties located on Yolanda Avenue into the light industrial zoning district for consistency with the city's general plan. The property is, as I mentioned, located on Yolanda Avenue. There are 4 properties included in this proposed rezone. This next aerial shows a little bit closer up view of those properties. The one thing I want to note is that the properties that are outlined in green, the 376, 380, and 386, those were the subject of the original application to rezone, again, consistent with the general plan. The property at 414 Yolanda Avenue was suggested by staff to be included in this because it would have left one single parcel in the CG zoning district, so it kind of create a little island of zoning inconsistency. So staff suggested adding that to this rezoning and worked with the applicant on that, and the applicant or the property owner who agreed to add on to this rezoning. So a bit of project history. In September of 2017, the application was submitted again for those 3 original parcels. In February of this year, staff mailed a letter to the property owner of that additional property at 414 Yolanda Avenue to let them know about the proposed rezoning. And then on March 8th, the Planning Commission reviewed the proposal and unanimously recommended approval to the council. So this slide shows the general plan and zoning for the site and the surrounding area. So as you can see, the properties are designated by the general plan as light industry, as are the properties to the, I guess that's it's north and south. anyway, east and west. Sorry, getting my bearings here. And the properties on either side are already in the light industrial zoning district. So again, this proposal would rezone it to be consistent into the IL zoning district. So the project was reviewed consistent with the California Environmental Quality Act and found to be exempt pursuant to section 15183. So no additional environmental review is required because the project is consistent with the city's general plan. The only issues with this project were just initially the look at adding that fourth parcel to the proposed zoning, and that issue was addressed working with the property owner. As of now, there are no unresolved issues with the project. There were several people in attendance at the Planning Commission meeting. Their concerns generally were related to potential cannabis uses that could potentially go in on these sites, as well as circulation and noise. Those potential cannabis uses would have their own discretionary review, and so neighbors would be notified of those potential projects. So with that, Planning Commission and the Planning and Economic Development Department is recommending that the council rezone these properties to light industrial, and staff is here to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you, Ms. Jones. Council, questions? So would any cannabis uses be allowed with the current zoning?
In the current zoning, no, because you'd have to find the consistency with the general plan. So the use, I think, right now most closely associated with general commercial is the dispensary use, and it wouldn't be consistent with the general plan. So that would not be permitted. Re-tenanting would really be the benefit here, and so getting these properties consistent with the general plan. There are cannabis uses that are allowed in the light industrial zoning district, so, but they all but one require some level of discretionary review in this location, and that one use would be a testing laboratory.
Are the two parcels on the northeast, are those residences or are those commercial?
It's bordered on the north side, yeah, by mostly residential, all residential actually.
I'm sorry, I'm talking about the two parcels within the rezoning.
Oh, I'm sorry, no.
376 and 380.
They're light industrial uses. I think they're originally residential structures. And you know what, the applicant was here earlier and he left. The uses that are in there now, I believe, are also commercial uses.
Okay. All right, this is a public hearing. I'll open the public hearing. I don't have any cards. Is there anybody who wants to address the council on this issue? Can't believe anybody left early tonight. Seeing no one rise, I'll close the public hearing. And Mr. Tibbetts, you have this item.
I move an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Rosa amending Title 20 of the Santa Rosa City Code by reclassifying the properties located at 367, 380, 386, and 414 Yolanda Avenue to the IL Light Industrial Zoning District, file number REZ 17-011, and waive further reading of the text.
Second.
Your votes? And that passes with 7 ayes. Thank you very much. Thank you. Moving on to 15.4.
Item 15.4, public hearing, Baldy Corner annexation pre-zoning 4377 and 91 Middle Rincon Road, and 4785, 4801, 4847, and 4865 Highway 12, file number ANX17-003, Patrick Streeter presenting.
Thank you, Mayor Coursey, members of the council. The item before you is a proposed annexation pre-zoning. The properties right now are within Sonoma County jurisdiction. They're not within the city. The first step for annexation is that the council determines what zoning would be applied to those properties once they are annexed into the city. The project before you is pre-zoning of 9 parcels that comprise approximately 8 acres. And there would be 2 different zoning districts applied, the R16, single family residential, and the CG, or general commercial zoning district. The properties are located at the intersection of Middle Rincon Road and Highway 12. As was previously mentioned, there are 9 parcels, and they are completely surrounded by City of Santa Rosa jurisdiction. So this is what's considered a county island. All of the parcels that are in that county island would be included in the future annexation, so they're also included in this pre-zoning. The properties are developed with several different types of uses, the most prominent being the 7-Eleven that's located at the corner. However, there are commercial uses located along the Highway 12 corridor, as well as residential uses as you move northward on Middle Rincon. And the surrounding land uses reflect that. There's residential uses as you head to the north and northeast and northwest, and it's primarily commercial along the Highway 12 corridor, though there is also residential located south of Highway 12. Applications for this pre-zoning were submitted in February of last year. And the project went before the Planning Commission in August of 2017. The council hearing was scheduled for January 30th. However, the applicant requested that the item be continued because ownership of several of the parcels was changed. And so they wanted to document that in our city files. The zoning, as was previously mentioned, right now is within the county. The surrounding zoning districts are residential to the north and commercial along Highway 12. And the general plan, which would be implemented through this zoning, is low density residential of 2 to 8 units per acre on the properties surrounding the corner, and then the corner itself is in the general plan as retail and business services. And as was mentioned, the pre-zoning would implement those types of land use designations through the zoning. The project was reviewed pursuant to the California Environmental Quality Act, and because the zoning districts are consistent with the general plan districts, no further review is required. However, a request was received by staff earlier this week from a representative of the Local Agency Formation Commission, or LAFCO, for Sonoma County, requesting that additional analysis of the CEQA determination be made. So staff will read that for the record now. The general plan land use designations for the subject site are retail and business services and low density residential, which designations were reviewed as part of the Santa Rosa General Plan 2035 Environmental Impact Report adopted by City Council Resolution number 27509, dated November 3rd, 2009. The proposed pre-zoning to the R16 single family residential zoning district is consistent with the low density residential land use designation, and the CG general commercial district is consistent with the retail and business services designation. Additionally, General Plan Policy LULA2 directs the city to annex unincorporated land adjacent to city limits and within the urban growth boundary when the proposal is timely and only if adequate services are available. Ensure that lands proposed for annexation provide a rational expansion and are contiguous to existing urban development. Therefore, the proposed pre-zoning and annexation actions have been considered and analyzed within the scope of the EIR. There are no significant environmental impacts that are peculiar to the project or the subject parcels, or that were not analyzed or discussed in the prior EIR, nor is there any substantial new information not known at the time the EIR was certified that would indicate that any previously identified significant effect might have a more severe adverse impact than discussed in that EIR. Here's the annexation boundary map. And regarding public comments, a neighborhood meeting was held for a project concept for those parcels. However, that project is not included in this annexation, and no formal applications have been received. However, comments from the attendees of that neighborhood meeting were also reflected by attendees of the Planning Commission meeting and included with meetings with staff earlier today, primarily coming from the 2 parcels located directly east of the retail and business service parcels. inquiring why, if they have commercial uses on site currently, they would not be annexed into a commercial zoning district. The explanation is that the general plan sets land use designations in line with kind of the broader analysis. And if you can see from, I think it's Venti Lane, just north of Highway 12, there was the intent that at some point that those residential uses, those subdivisions would probably be extended out. And because we applied the general plan across entire parcels, those parcels which are uniquely deep were applied to the residential land use designation in the general plan. And that's what the implementing zoning district would then be. The neighbors were also explained that the general plan process is dynamic, and we do have a general plan update in the works, and they'd be encouraged to participate because I think it could be supported to have split zoning on those parcels that would have commercial along the Highway 12 corridor. However, for this action, since it is on the simple level of implementing the general plan for the zoning, that's why the R16 zoning district is being applied. Also, late correspondence was received opposed to any development in eastern Santa Rosa until the intersection of Highway 12 and Farmers Lane is improved. So considering the fact that the pre-zoning would be implementing the general plan and that it's been reviewed compliant with CEQA, Planning and Economic Development Department is recommending, and the Planning Commission are recommending that the council by resolution introduce an ordinance for the pre-zoning of the properties located at 43, 77, and 91 Middle Rincon Road and 4785, 4801, 4847, and 4865 Highway 12 to the R16 single family residential and CG general commercial zoning districts. That concludes staff's presentation. The applicant has also stuck it out and is present in case there are any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Streeter. Council, are there questions? Yes, Ms. Combs.
Thank you. I'll try and be quick. Is on slide 4, you haven't listed 102, but it's in the same color set. So I'm just confirming that 102 is not part of the annexation area. It wasn't listed in your list, but it shows on my drawing as included in it by color. So I'm asking if if it's supposed to be in or out. It's across the street.
Apologies. The gray color indicates properties that are within the county.
So 102 is in the county.
It's in the county, but it's not part of this project.
Included as part of this annex. And why isn't it included in this annex?
The applicant requested that we consider this annexation for contiguous parcels, and because that one was across the street and it's part of a greater county island, it's not standalone.
Okay, so there's more county island to go in this area, so we're nibbling.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
Any further questions? This is a public hearing. I'll open the hearing. I have a card from Kurt Kruger. Not here. Anyone else like to address the council on this item? Close the public hearing. Mr. Schwedhelm, you have this item.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Move an ordinance of the Council of the City of Santa Rosa pre-zoning the properties located at 43, 77, and 91 Middle Rincon Road and 4785, 4801, 4847, and 4865 Highway 12 to the R16 single family residential and CG general commercial zoning districts. Assessors parcels number 182-540-020-023-024-025-026-027-028, file number ANX17-003, and waive further reading the text.
Second.
Your votes? That passes with 7 ayes. Thank you very much. We do have a written communication and any cards for public comment? Mr. Canini, I believe, has left the room. With that, we are adjourned.
Not bad, guys.